I think I don't like super duper nebulous terms, and I think stochastic terrorism is one such thing, right? Because who we're going to view as a terrorist is going to largely depend on like I don't know why we would even use it because it's there's so much plausible deniability baked into the term itself that it means close to nothing.
Final points.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm literally using Google. Terrorism, the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians in the pursuit of political aims. I don't know what was said on Saturday, but I know that Vivian has talked about extrajudicial violence against people for political reasons. I know that she's talked about,
Oh
basically people compiling
no!
lists
Sick
of
assassin. Oh, that is so
known
sad.
nefarious actors, and I would see that as extrajudicial advocation of violence and intimidation against civilians for political aims. Now, the question is whether or not these things are good.
sad.
Obviously, you can enact violence for principles that you believe in, but that's kind of like where definitionally I think we do get into a certain weird amount of water, because if compiling dox lists and sending death threats or pipe bombing Humvees in the name of like environmentalism, if that's terrorism, then it's also terrorism to chop off people's heads and commit suicide bombing. So there's obviously like a wide spectrum of violence that falls under the label terrorism. I think that the conversation for why terrorism is so nebulous and poorly used is related to Phil Gursky, somebody that I've talked to, basically said that homicide is homicide, murder is murder. So basically, by using this term, this very loaded term, and allowing it to be used in our public parlance so often, we're opening up a Pandora's box where we can just label anybody a terrorist for any amount of advocacy or violence that crosses some social threshold. And that's the danger of it. So for me, I have no problems with the use of the word, but I think we need to be specific. And while we're being specific, we probably shouldn't be wrestling over the definition. We should just agree that there's a spectrum of violence that falls under this label, and then say, like, I believe this person on a 0 to 10 between ISIS and people who pour sugar in the gasoline of high gasoline vehicles. I think this person is a 1.5, and then we can kind of have a conversation from there. But I'll leave it there, and I'm looking forward to the open. I'm sure it will be super mild.
Oh boy, Destiny, lots of things been said about you.
Oh, I didn't take notes for that opening. That I didn't know we were. I didn't know I was on defense right here. So I like the term stochastic terrorism because I think that there needs to be a way to describe calls to violence that aren't direct calls to violence. So given some time to expand my actual definition of stochastic terrorism, which I think aligns with how I've seen other people define it, stochastic terrorism is essentially you are publicly presenting a universe where the only option left is violent options. That's it. Violent action is the only way to rectify or remedy like a given situation. So good examples I think are when you have people saying things like foreign immigrants are invaders into your country, your politicians are all bought out and nobody's going to stop them, and they're going to come in and take over and ruin your way of life if nobody stops them. Like I think that you're creating a situation politically, or you're creating this air of this idea that the only way to stop these people is through violent action. Therefore, when you constantly engage in this type of rhetoric and somebody acts, you can't just kind of like wring your hands and be like, oh, well, who could have guessed, And then as a second example, I would say somebody like Donald Trump absolutely engages in this. When you say things like your electoral system has been hijacked, Pence isn't helping you, Congress isn't helping you, nobody's helping you, all the intelligence agencies, everybody's fucked. If somebody ends up doing a violent action, like say invading the fucking Capitol building on January 6th, I would argue that like you have engaged in a form as Donald Trump of stochastic terrorism. You're fomenting a situation where the only possible way to remedy it is through some violent action. Now, to get a little bit more personal, I think Pisco will try to attack me because of my reluctance to use terrorist as like an actual label. I will admit that if I'm like engaged in a conversation and someone's like, oh, are you familiar with like the terrorist organization ISIS? I'm probably just gonna be like, yeah, of course, or yeah, I know, like, yeah, these terrorists, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Now, like on a broader level, should I stop and say every time, well, I don't know if I would call them a terrorist organization, but yeah, maybe, sure, I could acknowledge that. The thing that I like the most about the stochastic terrorism definition, though, is just what it defines, not the idea that it is giving me a closer definition of terrorism. Like we could call this like stochastic incitement to violence or stochastic something else, and I would be just as okay with the term. It just seems like stochastic terrorism is what we ended up going along with. Terrorism is an incredibly nebulous thing. Every state has a different definition of it. Nation states have different definitions of it for a variety of reasons. It doesn't mean the same thing to any group of people. People that aren't terrorists, like the Mujahideen that was supported past Carter's administration, can become terrorists when they do things that we don't like. Some people consider the U.S. a terrorist nation. Like, it's the whole idea of like the word is just so silly to me. I just don't like it. I don't think it gets us anywhere. And yeah, there you go.
Lucas.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank Pisco for reminding me why I don't want to be a lawyer, because that was so boring to listen to. But stochastic terrorism. It's such a broad term that it encompasses a lot of things. I wasn't sure that I didn't know this was going to become the Trial of Destiny by Pisco. So I mean, if I knew that, I would have watched all of the things that Pisco accused Destiny of, so I could, follow along the conversation. Some of us have a life outside of Twitch. So the idea that Kyle Rittenhouse is being accused of things that he didn't do or hasn't been proven that he did. He went there, to whatever reason he went to, but the reason that he shot those people was in defense of property. And the fact that the media is, promoting a narrative that says that he did those things on purpose, I think it definitely would fall in the category of Jesus Christ, I can't say that word. Stochastic terrorism. Yeah.
Fabian, you go next. Or Scott, excuse me.
Yeah, so in the interest of not clout chasing, I will tailor my portion of this discussion to everyone but Destiny. Yeah, so I think first thing we need to look at is, obviously, I'm kind of two minds of this issue, right? I'm honestly kind of somewhere in between, because obviously someone like Vivian that will literally put you on her list of reactionaries and advocates for violence regularly is a problem, right? And if she was a right winger, she'd be banned off of every platform instantaneously. But at the same, and we could say the same thing about some of the rhetoric that our right wing politicians like Trump have gone in, right? So I mean, obviously there's kind of an issue here, and so when I think about the issue, I honestly don't think the issue is that we should create a new label, right? For people who are, kind of advocating violence and advocating political beliefs or advocating like really negative or derogatory or dehumanizing things, but they're not direct calls for violence or action, right? I'm not saying shoot this guy at 2 p.m. on this street corner. That's where he goes and gets his coffee, right? I'm just saying Republicans are evil and we hate them, or, Democrats are evil, et cetera, et cetera. I think the bigger issue here that really kind of goes tangential to this question is the fact that our journalistic ethics have gone away. Right, like it used to be a thing, and it's still a thing. If you go to if you take a mass communications class in college, that you're supposed to have 2 unnamed sources and then someone that's going to go on the record, right? Like that shit just disappeared with corporate press kind of getting money from this political balkanization of the American population. And so I'm not so sure that the issue per se are these people that we're trying to label with this kind of newer definition of terrorism, this more, this probability-based terrorism, but more so the fact that we don't have good information out there. I think this is more a problem of social media and a lack of journalistic ethics, to where when people hear wild, crazy shit, they can't just go and look up a news article and just get the good details and realize maybe that's crazy because of this reason and this reason and this reason, right? So I think that there's kind of a parallel conversation to be had here, and I don't care about Vivian, she's trash.
All right. Vivian's a wonderful human being. I love her so much. Shout out to you, McSpeen and Wolf. All right. Let's go to Gappy V.
Wow.
Okay. I guess in regards to the I don't know, our Destiny effort post that was made by Pisco, I think we're kind of getting a bit too hung up over the issue of I think Destiny using the word terrorism is what's really getting at it. And I think we had this talk a couple of days ago when we were talking about the federal rules of evidence. When we look at the federal rules of evidence 704 and 704A, just because somebody uses the term terrorism or negligence, for example, just because they use that word doesn't mean they're literally embracing it as this person is literally like ISIS or something like that. I think we're focusing a bit too much on the fact that the word terrorism was used and not the overall context of that opinion or that lay opinion as stochastic terrorism, right? It's not, I don't think he's going to be alleging, and I'm not sure what happened with this Vivian conversation, but I doubt he's going to be alleging that Vivian's literally trying to create like the next ISIS or whatever. But in terms of the actual stochastic terrorism definition, getting back to the actual topic rather than what was going on earlier, I think stochastic terrorism is totally a fine definition. You know, if people are trying to indirectly advocate for violence, we should have a way to be able to call them out for that. And I think when we use that definition, we have to understand that there are extents, right? It's not just, oh, so you literally just called him a terrorist. What the fuck, dude? It's about whether or not the extent is really fucking egregious, right? Because I think there's a huge difference between somebody retweeting, oh, the Rittenhouse judge is using some ringtone that sounds like it might potentially be from a Trump rally versus someone saying something a lot worse about like, oh, who's going to be getting the wall or who's going to be doing this non-TOS friendly thing to our parents one day. I think there's a huge worlds apart there, and I think being able to use that term of stochastic terrorism in the context of defining an extent to which somebody's advocating for violence is really important. And I don't think we should be getting hung up over whether one individual used the word stochastic terrorism on one individual when somebody else like Donald Trump is probably using stochastic terrorism to a far, far worse extent.
Hey, last but not least, our Dark Lord and Savior, Doobie.
Okay, so I've been thinking about this since the other night, actually. And what I've kind of concluded is that I think Twitch is full of mentally unstable people who ingest the opinions of charismatic demagogues through like 8-hour streams, and then go around and watch other charismatic demagogues react to the latest round of blood sports and relationship drama involving people they've developed like parasocial relationships with. So if we're going to buy the common lefty position that someone like Lauren Southern or Stefan Molyneux could be held responsible for Christchurch because the shooter might have heard like a great replacement video at some point, shouldn't we also believe that Destiny can be held responsible for vigilante justice against rioters if we find that the perpetrators have watched his streams at some point? If Vosh gets done demonizing conservatives for the day and raids Prime, and Prime is platforming an insane anarchist who dehumanizes and advocates for the violent suppression of their opposition all the fucking time, right? Aren't they both like at some level responsible if one of the hundreds or thousands of people watching goes out and acts on the recommendation someday? Shouldn't we believe that people like Hassan, who say that Rittenhouse was always going to get off because he's white, or that Jacob Blake was unjustifiably shot in the back by racist cops, couldn't they also be held responsible for riots that might happen if Rittenhouse gets off without a homicide charge? What about Fanatics' tacit endorsement of violence against white people who say the N-word? Or Connor's tacit endorsement of police goon squads that rough up people who resist arrest? Should any of us be platformed? Like, what's the fucking line here? I think that if we're going to say that these people are guilty of some kind of like stochastic terrorism or some kind of like incitement to violence for these kind of statements, then hey, if that's the line we're drawing, then I don't think there's a good case to be made for most of us to be on this platform.
Yeah, Gappy and Destiny have a problem with terrorism and not stochastic terrorism. What Doobie just gave you the point. What could be more nebulous than the word that engulfs Hassan, a word that engulfs potentially Destiny? Because I haven't seen how that he's distinguishing now his own comments from Vivian's comments. What is the definitional criteria for stochastic terrorism? Should there be a definitional criteria for stochastic terrorism, and why does it apply to Vivian and not?
I mean, I would
Destiny?
I would defend the comments that I made earlier. That when you've like facilitated or when you've created a situation,
not in relation to other to like common examples or to Lauren Southern as an abstract term. How do I know? How do I fight you on Vivian's label of a stochastic terrorism?
On how would you?
How could you not
without reference to
how great of a speech Doobie gave? Like,
wait. When you say without reference
without
to what
reference
she
to
said?
an example or without reference to Doobie made reference to Lauren Southern's comments, and we're talking about the definition in relation to others, but in abstract terms.
So my question would be like,
what does it mean?
Yeah. So if I were to look at the totality of Vivian's messaging, is Vivian essentially saying that there is no way to remedy a current situation or current set of problems beyond violent action? That's my question.
Then you misunderstood Vivian's point. because either you're referencing the fact that she's spreading misinformation, and if that's enough to be called a stochastic terrorist, then I don't know. And most of the country is responsible for stochastic terrorism. So I'm assuming it's not the fact that she's spreading misinformation.
No, spreading misinformation on I could, but not that. I don't know if that on its own would do it. But my issue with Vivian wasn't that. My issue with Vivian is that
she's advocating for violence in that specific situation in which there are people come in and speak.
Yeah.
Right.
So one was the idea that people that show up, that you have a right to basically force them out with the threat of murder or murder eventually or killing, I should say, to be less loaded. That you're allowed to kill people essentially that come to protest to an area where you don't want them protesting. Number one, and then number two, the undermining of our entire judicial system, saying that all of it is broken and fundamentally it won't work, and we should never expect anything from it.
That was couched in the first part, right? The part about violence was couched in qualifications and depended upon a set of predicate facts, which are exceptional.
I disagree.
They're exceptional.
No.
Do you think the Black Lives Matter protest was an exceptional protest?
No. I don't believe that Vivian couched it. I think that she couched it the same way that ethno-nationalists couch it when they try to say, like, I want to get rid of all black people in this country, but I don't want to do it violently. I just want to pay them. But when you run down that line, okay, well, what if they don't accept your payments? What if they don't want to leave the country? Then eventually, like, okay, sure.
Fabian Scott engaged in it. I mean, Fabian Scott all but said he's advocating for violent revolution in the United States. So you think that he's engaged in stochastic terrorism?
Yeah, for sure. I'd probably say that, yeah.
What is this word in that?
When you're creating a situation.
When the fuck did I say I was arguing for violent revolution?
When you're creating a situation where the only option is violence, that's the only way that you can seriously enact whatever agenda that you think is like morally righteous and needs to be done. Yeah, I would argue that you're engaged in a form of.
How nebulous is this? I mean, this word is going to gather.
Hold on. You can't just say nebulous and pretend that's an argument. If you want to claim that, my definition is pretty precise. If you want to push me on a specific example of something, that's fine. But I've given you a clear example. We can test things against that example. Don't call it nebulous. It's not nebulous at all.
Well, then it's too inclusive. It's over inclusive.
Like I argued your definition of terrorist was. What do you mean? How does this go?
You can't criticize me for my term for being too over inclusive and then provide an over inclusive term yourself.
Okay, what am I? Give me an example then of one thing that I'm inclusive.
I want to write down the definition. Can we just get that so that we can stop saying it's nebulous? I want to have it concrete.
Sure.
I have that he says that when the go ahead. When your rhetoric is such that the only possible response of people is violence, and in that, notice what is missing from that definition. There's no proclivity part of that definition where there's a likelihood or a tendency for your audience to be receptive to that message, for you to even have a platform for which to speak. If you said this privately, if I said this to you privately, Destiny, that I think that this is justified, you think my private communication to you is stochastic terrorism?
Yeah, we can argue that it's private stochastic terrorism, but we can even say
stochastic terrorism.
Sure, but we can even hold on.
Do you agree with that definition?
What?
Do you agree with that definition?
Yes. Okay. But like we can even argue that if you don't like the term, because it sounds like you don't disagree that this is a thing that should exist in like have some way to address it.
I disagree as applied to Vivian, and I think there should be.
It just sounds like you okay. But like let's say for instance that we're having a private conversation, a one-on-one private conversation, and you're telling me this is bullshit. I want to be a professional StarCraft 3 player. I can't because my mom and dad won't let me on the computer. And I say, listen, bro, they're not going to let you go to the library. They're not going to give you your laptop back. If you want to do this, you have to fucking kill your mom and dad, right? In a video game.
Because you're missing two components. You're missing two components.
Okay,
because terrorism.
So you can try to expand this and say, oh, you're missing blah 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 blah. But I'm giving you a clear example where you're saying, because initially the reason I'm giving you the example is earlier you said, well, you're telling me that in a private one-on-one conversation you call it stochastic terrorism. I just gave you an example of a private conversation where yes, I would say that's stochastic terrorism.
But but nobody who understands the core concept of terrorism applied across all definition is a broader ideological goal.
Speculation.
A broader ideological goal, a broader religious, political motive that isn't present in your private violence example. Now, on the margin, that's going to be fuzzy, but there are clear cases of...
there is no universally agreed upon definition of terrorism.
I understand that, no, but the core to the concept of terrorism, I think everyone here would agree that there is some substantive ideological motive beyond mere private revenge or mere private...
Here's the point.
It's ideologically motivated,
even if I read off of the fucking FBI site, okay? It's violent criminal acts committed by individuals and or groups to further ideological goals stemming from domestic influences such as political, religious, social...
This is terrorism, not stochastic terrorism.
Hold on, I'm not done, okay? Political, religious, social, racial, or environmental. I could almost any possible fucking thing.
No, you couldn't. No, you couldn't.
Give me an example of one.
100% could.
If I run over someone because they had sex with my wife.
Mm-hmm.
Is that terrorism?
Let's say that we went onto your laptop afterwards and we found out that you were posting on a whole bunch of incel forums. Does it become terrorism?
It's fuzzy margins. Yeah, if you can understand. So
this is kind of ridiculous.
No,
wait, hold on.
This entire process.
I understand.
You're just calling out Destiny for fucking clout.
No.
Hijacking
No, stop. Wait, hold on. Pisco.
The only reason you're doing this shit is so that people will react to Pisco.
I don't care. I'm not.
Destiny,
I don't have
more fucking views.
Can we not?
This isn't my job. This isn't my job. Conversation. No, I actually am engaging with this conversation.
Okay, hold on, Pisco. Yeah, Pisco.
Wait,
hold on. I want to understand your position. So, someone like Anwar, what's his name? Anwar al-Awlaki, this dude who's making videos to encourage people in the United States and in Europe to go out and murder people at random, right? Like encouraging like jihadi violence.
Yeah.
Do you think that person couldn't be held responsible for those people who went out and did exactly what he was encouraging them to do?
But what you're missing there, and what's missing from the definition that Destiny gave, are two concepts. Before I bring them up, I want to just address the elephant in the room of categories. Everything is fuzzy on the ends. Define a sandwich, right? Tell me, what are the definitional criteria of a sandwich? You know, a coffee maker might not be a sandwich. That's a clear case of not being a sandwich. And now when you start to get to a hot dog, it's less clear about what is and what is not a hot dog.
That's okay, though, because those types of categories don't have moral weight or implication behind them. So I'm okay with sandwich being fuzzy. But when you want to bring up a new term and you want to call it terrorism, and you want to either, no, I'm not saying you're saying this, but for some people that want to have additional charges brought forth, or in your case, where you just want to have like a greater moral condemnation brought forth, well, now we actually need to define this a little bit more. The delineation becomes important when it's a moral issue and not just a category of what is like.
Yours is way too over-inclusive, because you just said
it is too inclusive, and it's really insane. Because Destiny, I didn't see you like raising up this like claim that we need to make sure that we're really, really clear when they brought up RICO charges against R. Kelly. Not that nigga wasn't guilty, not that he didn't deserve to do prison, but we know what RICO charges are, and that seemed like that wasn't the proper application there. Furthermore,
what was he doing?
Furthermore, when you make the statement that your definition is when your rhetoric is such that the only possible remedy is violence, can you point me to something that Vivian said that clearly denoted that clearly like the only possible remedy was violence? Because even when she's talking about how corrupt our judicial system is and how unfair it is, all of those things, you could easily say, so we need to do a lot. We need to make sure that we have higher voting mobility in order to ensure that these kind of things can be done. We got to make sure we don't re-elect these judges. So
how is that Fanatic? But hold on, Fanatic. I don't know if you missed the stream. I don't know if you missed the stream on Saturday, but this is not what we're talking.
I watched the entire thing. So anyway, all I'm saying is there's nothing that you're saying, and unless Destiny can point me to something specifically where the only possible remedy is violence, then it sounds like this is an improper usage. So Destiny, the floor, you have the floor. What did she say specifically?
So, okay, I don't remember every word, but I'm going to say some things about Vivi's positions, and I don't think she would disagree with them, right? The issue is when you start to say what you said before, that these systems are broken, blah, 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 blah. If you were to go on and say things like, well, we should vote for different people, blah, 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 somebody like Vivian would say, no, voting doesn't do anything. No, you can't fix these institutionally. No, we need pressure from the outside. None of these things will be fixed with them because capitalism supports capitalism, power supports power. That's the issue at some point, and then that's why they get into eventually justifying things like riots against private property, because as they're saying, well, there was no other alternative. Voting does nothing. It's worthless. It's a waste of time. When you've engaged in that line of rhetoric, then the only option left is violence. That's literally all there is left.
Stop. In fact, she was explicitly endorsing violence. She was saying that if someone shows up in your town with a Blue Lives Matter sticker, right? You should force them out of your town, and that if they resist your force against them, you might need to kill them. Right, so don't dance around. This is exactly what she was saying. Qualified how?
Real question, right? To the people that disagree with this, the usage of this term. What in the fuck do you call people who advocate for violence, right? Who consistently dehumanize groups of people, but do not use direct or actionable violence, right? That do not specifically themselves go out and commit the violence, or you can't prove that per se, right? I wouldn't surprise me if that was happening, right, under some black bloc shit, right? But let's just say, right, that they're not actually committing the violence, but they're dehumanizing groups of people. They're calling for violence. They're saying violence is the only possible solution we have to this problem, right? But they're not giving you a specific date and time. what term would you use?
I'm happy to answer that question.
Yeah, I'm legitimately.
The two concepts you're missing is one, there needs to be some statistical proclivity of that happening. We don't just call people who have no audience speaking to no one or speaking privately to someone who's not receptive to that message stochastic terrorists.
Right,
We're talking about people on Twitch.
Let him finish.
People on Twitch with an audience.
Holy shit.
I'm showing you ways to distinguish. And then secondly, we need to reject Destiny's invitation to absurdity, which is that any call to private violence, even no matter how private, could somehow be considered stochastic terrorism, no matter the ideological.
You're avoiding. You're avoiding.
You already said the keywords. Ideological.
No, hold on. No, you're avoiding. No, counter. Hug yourself. Counter. Go paint your fucking Barbies. Okay, Pisco. We're talking about people on Twitch, on a platform in front of hundreds or thousands of people, not someone talking to their friend in a corner somewhere, right? So these people.
What I'm saying is the way you distinguish it is what I just said. So there's two things that you look at the Twitch person, right? Is their audience such that they're super receptive? There's a danger here. Their message is such that it could be interpreted that way. You look at the quality, the likelihood that their
the answer to all those things is yes.
Okay,
in this specific scenario, the answer is absolutely yes.
I think
there are plenty of people in chat right fucking now who think that people with Blue Lives Matter stickers are Nazis.
I think
you either resist Nazis or violence.
I think you guys are insane that you think that Vivian's comments, unless you want to say her attitude in the aggregate, is
one that would. Answer the fucking question, or are you just going to dodge?
I'm answering the question.
It's really simple. It is.
No. I am answering the question.
Endorsement. That's the answer. Endorsement. Endorsement is the answer.
It's not the answer. Proclivity is important here, and the likelihood of the tendency of your actions to cause others to commit that violence is important here. And so
he says, give an arbitrary amount of proclivity, and then tell me what you would call that.
No. There are clear cases and there are unclear cases. That's the same with any category. I'm answering the question on.
You're not answering the question. It's really simple. So Vivian, one word answer. Is there a title? He's asking for a title. I don't care about all of the qualifications. I don't care how you get to the title. What is the title?
What do you mean the title? What title? I don't understand what you mean.
Shut the fuck up. What would you call someone like Anwar al-Awlaki who was making videos encouraging people to go on?
No, you can't.
Okay, there it is. Okay.
You're okay with the term.
I never.
Okay. Oh my God! Shut up. Everyone, shut up. Great. All right. Look, because he's going to explode. I'm going to let counterpoints in, and then Gappy. Don't worry. All right. We'll get these answers out of people.
Y'all are about to make me fucking ableist again. Holy shit. So, Pisco. Very specifically, it would not be stochastic because stochastic basically says that it's not direct. It's nebulous intentionally so you can motivate an audience in order to do something.
What is not stochastic? It wouldn't with reference to what?
Anwar al-Awlaki would not be stochastic because he is making specific prescriptions in order to commit terrorism.
You disagree with Destiny because Destiny was talking about a direct message where it was very explicit.
I just want to speak for myself. I don't want to speak for anybody else, okay? So Anwar al-Awlaki would not be stochastic because he's being very specific with what he wants to do. When it comes to stochastic terrorism, I think, as I acknowledge, there's a spectrum to fucking terrorism and fucking violence and all that kind of shit. The reason why I am comfortable saying that about Vivian, actually, I love Vivian. I like the fact that she owns her bullshit and she just fucking says it instead of fucking dodging left, right, and fucking center. One of the things that she said was that in the past, she's participated in anti-fascist fucking movements. They greeted people at the fucking train station. They got into a fucking scrap. They kicked their ass and they sent them home. And she thinks that it's appropriate to have non-state actors engaging in political violence in order to achieve a certain amount of ends. If I was to take the definition of terrorism, which is basically non-state actors very specifically engaging in violence towards political ends for civilians, the first word is met. And then for stochastic, where it's vague and nebulous and not intentional and specific, if that's also met, where it's a generalization about things, I understand that like Mixed Vivian Wolf is not the same as fucking Anwar al-Awlaki, but at the same time, both words have been met. It's a question of spectrum, and we have to be nuanced. If you don't want to see the state clamp down on people like Mixed Vivian Wolf, I agree with you. I think there's room in here for speech and opportunity and all that kind of stuff. But one of the things that I thought was kind of missing from your point was the fact that like, intent doesn't necessarily matter if there isn't a result, if the intent still existed in the first place. And you were saying because a person has like stochastic violence in mind, but they don't achieve the goal, therefore they're admonished of the attempt. I don't agree with that at all. If they have
never
the
said that.
violence,
when did I ever say that? I never said that.
No,
you just said that.
Then don't
to be clear, I don't reject. I don't reject the term stochastic terrorism. I'm rejecting your definitional criteria, which does not include some statistical likelihood or some greater ideological purpose. Those two things must be key. Otherwise, we're way over inclusive.
In a legal definition instead of a
Fabian,
colloquial expression.
Fabian, as you see now, you just can't ask Pisco questions like that. He won't actually answer them. So
I just answered it.
The answer is to your question, Fabian. The answer to your question is the idea is for the people who are doing it directly, you just call them terrorists.
I think or rather than terrorists, I think Pisco. So hold on, let me turn the temperature down. Right. So Pisco's problem is, it sounds like you're essentially saying that you can't really call this an indirect incitement to violence if the likelihood of any violence actually occurring isn't there.
Zero.
Right. But my problem then is, aren't we really just basically copy pasting the definition then of incitement to violence?
No, because the other component which you're missing from your definition is the same thing that's present in the terrorism definition. It's not just violence or crime. It's even though there are edge cases, I submit to you, mixed motive cases, an ideological purpose there. That has to be present. In all these definitions of terrorism, some greater fundamental societal ideological purpose needs to be present there. And so not...
Okay, wait, so yeah, can I just wait? I just want a really clear question. By that definition then, would you be comfortable saying that every single BLM riot was a terrorist riot? Because that was something...
Are we talking stochastic terrorism?
No.
Terrorism?
Terrorists. Those were terrorists in the United States.
If it's violence...
Yes.
Yeah. So if it's violence for a greater ideological end, I have no problem labeling it terrorist.
Okay, so then,
just to keep in mind, I just want to get this out.
Okay.
I think we all must agree on this. The definition of terrorism cannot depend on the substantive rightness or wrongness of the underlying motive position, right? Everyone agrees with that. We cannot say that it's terrorism only when it's people.
But the problem is, colloquially, that seems to be how it goes. But yeah, I understand that. But so then,
your definition of terrorism cannot.
I agree. I never said it.
Has to tread the same line that I did, where 100%. We're going to call some stuff we like.
But the thing is then at that point, literally every single riot, because most of these have social causes. I think it's maybe there are some that don't, but for the most part, then every single riot then is an act of terrorism, or at least domestic terrorism.
Not necessarily. I mean, if it's an act of so you can.
Okay, how about let's say every single riot that's caused due to social unrest, we can all say that these are all acts.
Not necessarily. I mean, I could see an artful argument that this was not an act in pursuit of an ideological aim. It was just an act of rage, or let's say for the looting, this was not an act of. For an ideological purpose, this was just someone taking advantage of heightened tensions to just steal stuff. So there can be cases where it doesn't fit it because the specific person does not have that ideological purpose that needs to be present. Does that make sense?
No. So you would still label the broader movement as something that's terrorist, even?
No. I'm not as comfortable labeling like broad swaths of people. That's why I'm not comfortable saying that like in the aggregate. Vivian contributes to an overall attitude that says there's no other option left but violence, because it doesn't feel fair to attribute sort of collective punishment to someone who's part of a movement for which there are a lot of members who certainly are fit that definition.
Collectively punish all of them.
Pisco, both your criteria are met with Vivian.
No, because the proclivity. Yes. No, the proclivity definition is not there.
Yes. Wait, hold on. Yes, because
you're making it legal.
If this person is coming onto panels over and over for months, right? Coming onto panels regularly. And making these same kind of statements over and over again, there's a greater than 0% chance that someone in this audience of fucking terminally online weirdos has like the fucking combination of personality characteristics that might put them on the verge of going over the edge and going out and doing some lone wolf shit.
You're misunderstanding. So I think we would all agree that the point that the quote stochastic terrorism is committed is at the point the statement is made, correct?
Yes.
And so it's not post hoc. Right? And so to the extent that you think at the time Vivian's making the statements, those particular comments are likely to incite any particular person to violence.
No,
the odds of that, can I finish? So the odds of that are very extremely low. She's on a panel where everyone, including myself, is fighting against her in front of mostly libs and left-wing people who are not, I don't think have the propensity to violence anyway, on Twitch, on a platform. I really think that the odds of that happening are extremely low given her comments, and the fact that her comments are couched in qualifications and predicate facts that do not present themselves commonly in society.
We can't say any of
We can't
Sorry,
say
hold
any
on,
of this
Gappy hasn't got a chance to talk, so Gappy, please.
We can't say that any of this is non-zero though. Yeah, she's getting completely. I'm not aware of all of her fucking comments, but obviously she's getting pressed on by the rest of the fucking panel. But there's no way we can completely say it's.
What about Destiny's comments? What about Destiny? I feel like is Destiny a stochastic terrorist? Why not? Why isn't he?
Yes. We have to,
yes.
Yeah.
Destiny, you should
totality of circumstances depends on what he's advocating for.
Destiny, are you a stochastic terrorist?
The problem is.
Wait, no, I want to hear his answer. I want to hear his answer.
I've been trying to talk for at least half an hour. I'm gonna get my fucking answer in, and then you can ask him whatever the fuck you want, okay? I gotta do my own fucking cloud chasing here. I'm the most desperate for content here. I need to fucking get in here, all right? Because the problem is, I feel like, ironically enough, we're looking for different other factors in order to determine the propensity of the likelihood that they're actually going to be causing some sort of issue and the ideological strength of those beliefs and those motives, right? Yet at the same time, at the same fucking breath, we're looking, and I'm going to pull out case law here, we're looking for some type of term in yellow versus City of Chicago shit, where there has to be fighting words, or we have to have some specific type of statement that's a specific incitement of violence, and only then, when we have that type of direct evidence, we can call it stochastic terrorism, rather than looking at the totality of the circumstances overall.
I submit to you, Gappy, that anything that Viv did, a Destiny statement qualifies for, and I want to hear Destiny's, by his own criteria, isn't that comment you made a form of stochastic terrorism?
I think you could argue. I think you could say, yeah, sure, yeah, for sure.
Wait, hold on, wait, no, don't do that.
Okay, so
don't
say I think you can say yes.
Hold on, no, wait, hold on, whoa, don't ever say, don't say that, okay? I don't need somebody to tell me what I can or cannot bite the bullet on. As Pisco said earlier, I think that we can say that there are forms of terrorism, whatever we want to define that term as. I think it's different, that we would all probably support. For instance, like the fucking revolution of the United States, right? Is arguably these were early on acts of terrorism, or any type of violent protest that happened in the Civil Rights Act was arguably like acts of terrorism, however we want to define terrorists at or whatever, right? I wouldn't use the term, but if we were going to, sure. We can also say that there are forms of stochastic terrorism where, like, hey, you know, there are certain groups of people in certain circumstances. We can say like domestic violence victims, or people that have been kidnapped by somebody. We're like, hey, you know, if somebody's taking you to another location, you don't have contact with anybody else. Like sometimes all you can do is fight back. We can argue, yeah, sure, these might be forms of stochastic terrorism for sure. I'm not saying that stochastic terrorism.
Stochastic terrorism? I mean,
what?
Yeah, you did.
Yeah.
You did.
Okay, hold on. I'm not trying to say that in and of itself it's necessarily a bad thing. We can take one step further and we can analyze, like, is this like a good call to violence or not? Because I think there are righteous and good calls to violence. I think we all believe that. However, I don't think in the case where we're saying that all of our U.S. institutions have fundamentally failed, so we need large swaths of Americans killing other large swaths of Americans. If you want to say that that's on the same level as saying, I believe that people should have a right to defend their property. I mean, you can make those comparisons if you want, but I think that I have much better ground to stand on than Vivian, who's essentially giving you carte blanche to murder every fucking conservative in the United States.
Dude, and can I?
Okay, but to be clear, Destiny, when you made that comment about the rioters, you said they have your blessing to go out and do that. So
the rioters?
So I don't know that.
I said that people. Yeah. I said that people whose private property is being destroyed in a video game would have my support in whatever. Yeah, wait, hold on, wait, hold on. That is exactly what I said.
You said white redneck militia mowing down dipshit protesters.
No.
You said they'd have your blessing.
Hold on. I'm not here to answer for a 15-second clip. If you want to go back and watch the video, it is painfully obvious what I'm talking about. My entire argument was that if the cops aren't going to show up, if nobody else is going to help you, if you want to defend your property, I believe you should have the right to do so. It wasn't about indiscriminately killing protesters. If you think that, you're either retarded or you only watched the 15-second clip. That is exactly what you just said. You just said that.
No, that's not true. No, I said, okay, initially I said rioters. No, when I said dipshit protesters, I said dipshit protesters because that's what you said. Those are your words.
You get mad
at somebody for you said.
Quoting your
Wait, you said if that means, okay, I know that you were talking about how the riots and the burning of buildings and all this shit needed to stop. I agree with you, right? But when you said that if that means that white redneck militia dudes need to go out and mow down dipshit protesters, right? If they think they can torch buildings at 10 p.m., right? Then they have your blessing. You said that. Right. So I think
in the context of should people be able to defend their private property when other people are invading their shit and blowing it up and the cops are going to do it? Yeah, that's my personal belief.
Okay. So
it's almost like we look at the totality of the circumstances of a statement rather than one 15-second clip. I don't know why we keep trying to find one single fucking statement to go off of somebody instead of actually looking at fucking everything.
Shut up. So do you think it'd be reasonable, right, for somebody to say that if someone did go out and mow down a bunch of dipshit protesters who were burning down buildings at 10 p.m., if that did happen, and they found that person had listened to your stream at some point, they could say that you're responsible for this.
If somebody would have listened to a 15-second clip and that's all they took, then yeah, sure, you can argue that like my rhetoric in that case played into it to some extent. Sure, I definitely got really spicy in that conversation. That's fine, but just don't walk around pretending like I'm trying to say that you should go down and murder protesters, right?
I don't think that at all.
Sure, I could phrase it better, but I do support people that want to defend their private property, even if it's not necessarily legal in the United States. I support people
even if it's stochastic terrorism.
Can we? Wait, hold on, stop, hold on. You keep trying to think this is an own Pisco. I also support terrorism of women who are being fucking raped and murdered in Afghanistan by the fucking Taliban. Okay, so when you keep saying like, oh, well, you support terrorism, that's not an argument. You're not making a good argument. You're not getting an own. You're not getting a good point across. There are absolutely times where I think you can justify large acts of violence against certain types of state entities or certain types of non-state entities. Don't come at me for January
6th. So don't come at me for January 6th.
I'm not coming at you for January 6th. I think that was a horrible thing. I think that was all horrible as well. What do you mean? I'm saying on here.
I think it was yeah.
I think that Trump engaged in a form of stochastic terrorism. I just don't like the individual labeling of people as terrorists. I just think it's an arbitrary, dumb term. I mean, every state has a different definition. It doesn't mean anything. It's a totally different thing.
Yeah. So Connor.
I'm gonna jerk off a bunch of ghost dicks. Holy shit, motherfuckers. So, okay,
record for us,
like 15 fucking minutes. Yeah, Doobie, you are banned from my Gooning server. You are no longer allowed to listen to grown men jerking off. Okay?
That's fucked up.
So, you cut me off one too many times. You should have fucking listened to me. So, anyways, Pisco. Back when we were trying to parse out like multiple fucking definitions in the things, and we were using BLM, which was an interesting example, particularly because it would be uncomfortable for people to label the BLM movement as a terrorist movement, despite there being some violent elements of it, but there also being like a broader ideological movement that's seeking political change within the country. I think that was an interesting point. But to separate out that point, there's sub-factions within the BLM movement. There's general protesters who are using peaceful protest in order to advocate for those goals. We would not call those people terrorists. There are some people who are calling to violence, which I would say they are using stochastic terrorism while maybe not being terrorists themselves. And then there was the one guy who shot like 7 cops to death in Dallas, who I do think was a ideologically motivated individual who was non-state, who used ideology as an excuse for violence and engaged in violence against people in an indiscriminate way. I would call that individual a terrorist. But to kind of parlay this back into the fucking conversation, I'm sure there were tens of thousands of people who were talking about killing cops as vengeance for unjustified police homicides. I'm sure there were tens of thousands of them. And would I call them individually terrorists? No. But would I say that they were engaging in stochastic terrorism because eventually it would culminate into a violent eruption? I would say, yeah, they're contributing to that. And I think that's the definitional parse out that we're trying to get to.
I think that's fair, Connor. I think that's a fair point you make. Just be careful about this sort of aggregate effect element to it, because I think that aggregate effect, where every member of that aggregate is now a stochastic terrorist, could be applied to like Trump's base. And in which case, 30% of the country is stochastic terrorists.
I think we're way too fixated about that. I think we're way too fixated on this idea that like if you're like a stochastic terrorist, it's the worst fucking thing in the world. I don't think that's I think it's probably worse to steal from a fucking grocery store than it is to be a quote unquote stochastic terrorist, depending on scale. We just need some way. We need some term to describe what it is. If we don't like the term stochastic terrorism, that's fine. But there has to be something in between. This is just my random speech, and I'm literally telling you to murder somebody. There is this group of rhetoric in the middle where you're undermining institutions, where you're telling people that all hope is lost, and the only action that they have is violence at that point. When you're engaged in that form, we need a word to describe it. It sounds like, Pisco, you're like really hung up on the term stochastic.
No,
if you want to pick another term, that's fine. But this idea...
That's fine.
No, but it's not fine because you're disagreeing, because you're saying that like you need to be able to show there's actually clearly when there's a good chance that somebody in an audience might enact some form of violence. But that's not true. We're never going to know that. Nobody can ever know that, right? For fucking what Connor's saying, it might have been that the guy that went and killed the fucking cops, he might have just heard some fucking 100 viewer YouTuber who said it. He's like, you know what, this really vibes me, and then he went and did it, right? We don't know that. This is how the nature of online communication and large form communication works.
That's actually the
more uncertain. The more uncertain you are, the more uncertain you are, the more over inclusive it is. And so just be careful about that term's use.
Okay, being really inclusive.
I think we're really the fact that it's not going to have. It's not going to consider that fact.
Okay, wait 1 second. I think we're really focused on Vivian. I don't think. Wait, I don't think there's a reason to be, because we're totally missing out. We're totally missing out on. We're totally missing out.
Moderating occurring.
We're totally missing out on the HQ, right? Which is the HQ. We're totally missing out on the HQ, right? Which is someone like Hassan, right? On his platform, right? Saying that Kyle Rittenhouse would have gotten off no matter what because he's white. Totally misrepresenting the facts of the case to his audience. Totally misrepresenting the facts of the Jacob Blake case to the audience. I saw on fucking TYT, right? Separate from Hassan, sort of. Fucking Anna Kasparian the other day said that during the trial was the first time she'd ever seen any of the videos related to the Kyle Rittenhouse event. Any of them, any of the shooting videos. They've been making videos about that shit for a year. It's fucking insane. So how are these people not responsible in some way for riots or violent protests that happen as a result of their coverage of these events?
You asking me?
So I'm asking any of you. Hold them accountable.
No, like this is literally
So I want to hold on. I also want to get Fnatic in because he hasn't gotten a chance to speak. So Fnatic, go ahead if you have anything you want to add. If you're muted. You're already muted. So.
Is anybody here saying that they are completely divorced from like any of the violence that would occur? I don't think that's the case. Like I feel like what's happening here is like it's like we keep arguing as if we have a disagreement on what stochastic terrorism is, and we don't. Like everyone here at least has an understanding. Like we all agree, like this is what it is. Now the only disagreement I thought was whether or not it applied to Vivian or whether or not it applied to Destiny.
No, we're disagreeing on the likelihood of somebody in an audience to commit an act, for whether or not you're engaged in stochastic terrorism or whatever.
Whether or not it's a factor to consider, and the ideological purpose behind it.
Well, don't say all because
sure.
just
Okay, I don't even
Destiny.
think. Okay, good. So then let's ask this: is there any person that thinks that if you do something that has a 1% chance of a person committing violence, that you would still be a stochastic terrorist?
Yes.
Potentially, if your audience is big enough, yeah. For sure.
I would like to take a position, right, that I think that the term itself is problematic. And here's why I think the term itself is problematic. Okay? Because you get into ironically enough, the term can actually reinforce itself. When you start calling people terrorists that aren't necessarily terrorists, you almost engage in what the definition of the term itself is. You start calling your political opponents, you start hinting at the fact that they're terrorists, right? When they don't fit the definition of terrorism. And I think, which is the point I was trying to make in the beginning, in my opening statement, is that I think really what we need to engage with is we need to understand how social media affects our culture, and we need to understand how journalistic integrity rotting on both sides of the fence, right? Like, this isn't me being like, lies, the left-wing media lies, you're wrong, right?
That's
like,
pretty good.
I'm trying to say that like Fox News, CNN, all of them, they're all engaging in a lack of journalistic ethics. And so this is why these situations become dangerous, right? This is why, like exactly what Doobie was talking about with like Anna Kasparian coming out here, and she's able to portray herself as a journalist, and yet she's done literally no fucking research that like your average 40-year-old mom that watches Facebook videos.
Whose fault is that? Wait, whose fault is that?
I'm not pointing to a single individual. I'm
Point to an
talking about
institution.
I'm talking about culture, right? Institutions and government are downstream from culture, right?
So, yeah, but I think the problem is you said, and hold on, I'm really aggressive right now, so you might not have exactly meant this.
Right,
sorry,
like,
right?
I'm not trying to come at you, bro.
No, I understand. I'm not saying come at me, but like I don't like this idea of blaming the media. I think that if there were people out there that do good research, and they're on this platform, okay? There are people on this platform that present things that I really.
I'll give an example, right?
I give example.
CNN,
the Rose Wrist guy on this channel, the Kyozen guy, Wicked Supreme. These are people who are relatively dispassionate people. Or we can look at larger things. But I'm just saying, like, even on this platform, there are people that like do decent analysis that are relatively dispassionate. They're not like screaming at everybody. Nobody wants to watch that shit. They want to watch us scream at each other over whatever shit we're screaming at each other on. Or when it comes to mainstream media.
I'll give an example, right? What? So I think like an example of the causes of this, right? And why I think this should be more tailored to an understanding of social media and journalism as opposed to just talking about individuals that spout bullshit, right? Rand Paul, right? Everyone remember the Rand Paul story where he got attacked by, you can say BLM, you can say Black Bloc, whoever they fucking were, right? They were screaming. Well, he's been attacked a few times, right? But when he was with his wife following the Trump speech at the RNC, right? He was attacked and they were screaming, say her name.
Breonna.
This is the dude who literally wrote the Justice for Breonna Taylor Act, right? Like this, because he's a Republican, the idea was he must be bad, right? He must be one of those piece of shit cop supporters that likes the idea that like no-knock warrants are used and celebrates Breonna Taylor's death. So they're screaming, say her name, to the motherfucker who wrote the Breonna Taylor bill, right? So like I think the issue isn't necessarily the talking heads on Twitch and YouTube. While they do play a role, I think it's an overarching issue about the way that our culture is changing and the way that journalism is not, it's not easy for us to find accurate information anymore, because all of these large media places have massive amounts of bias. They don't fucking cite their sources like they should be. They don't use two unnamed sources and one going on the record, and this bias churns up more of this bullshit because they want clickbait. And so I think we have to talk about like what our social media and what our journalistic ethics are doing, and not necessarily Vivian to an audience of a couple hundred people saying some bullshit. Yeah, she's a piece of shit, obviously, right? Like, she calls for violence against people because of their political ideology and not because they're actually harming her in any like specific way, right? Like, that's a terrible fucking take, and you know, it's a bad person that does that. That being said, labeling her a terrorist, right, tends to lead towards this situation where we're having more and more it's becoming more and more difficult to separate. Like, if Antifa is just terrorists, then I'll never talk about Antifa. We should just kill them in a video game. That's not good, right? Like, right, no. But it's still schistic. I understand that there's a differentiation in terms, but I'm saying it's also a loaded term.
I understand and I agree that it is a loaded term, but I think that there needs to be like almost a zero tolerance in society for people that are giving these types of positions, because
I'm on two minds of it. I'll agree with you on that too.
Yeah, because the problem is that like, what you're saying is that using...
I don't want to dehumanize them, though.
I understand, but it's not so much whether you dehumanize that. The problem is that, like, you literally have people that are... So here's what I would say, okay? There is a... Okay, I don't think it'll probably happen, but there's definitely a chance that there could be violent riots following the Rittenhouse verdict, right? That somebody else might get killed as a result of that, right? The only reason why you would go and riot afterwards is because you've been misled by somebody else about the facts of the case. That is the only reason you would go out and riot, assuming he gets an innocent on all charges verdict, right? So in that case, how do you not draw a straight line from people on this platform or YouTube or in the mainstream media? Fucking Joe Scarborough just yesterday, I think, said that like he fired 60 rounds of his rifle that night. He fired like 8, okay? When you've got people that are directly saying this type of shit and then people go out and they enact violence because of it, I think that's fucked up. And I think there should be a zero tolerance for that kind of rhetoric. When you're saying like, you have to,
the problem here is, are we dehumanizing people that we disagree with politically for the speech that they use that we disagree with?
It's not about just disagreeing with speech.
Furthering balkanization.
No, it's not just about disagreeing with speech. It's like the idea that like you're calling for people to essentially become like violent actors. You're saying that's the only
I obviously have no problem with saying this person's a piece of shit. Like I keep saying
it needs to be more than that. Like if somebody's trying to say all Muslims are invading your country, they're gonna kill you all and rape all your women, right? Like, well, I don't want to dehumanize them. I'm not really concerned about that. I think that type of rhetoric should be like close to zero.
They're doing that shit anyways.
Does intentionality matter to you, Destiny? I mean, if someone's like, well, I didn't, like, and it's supposed that they're genuine and they didn't really mean for their comments and their misinformation to cause violence. Suppose you could read their mind. Would you say, okay, that person,
I think it becomes
an idiot?
I think it becomes similar in a legal sense to where I want to say for some crimes, like the intentional act can almost be as bad as like the reckless endangerment, like the willful reckless endangerment. So like I wouldn't say that it's on the same level, but I would say it's like it's pretty close. So like a Facebook mom sharing a meme, nah, I don't think so. But like somebody like me or Hassan who does this shit, 8 hours a day, should probably know better. And also to be clear, again, nobody's gonna be perfect. Everybody makes mistakes. I'm not saying that like nobody should ever do this. If you do it one time, you need to be excised from all of society or whatever. But I'm saying like this idea, because I've done this in the past. You can say argue with my fucking terrorist comments or whatever, or you can say that I've been wrong on my analysis of some case, or I retweeted a headline without reading the fucking thing. I've done it too, of course. But like there should be a low to zero tolerance for that type of behavior in society. Like we should absolutely demonize the fuck out of it.
I'm just saying, especially intentionally. That's like the frustration with this thing is like if it happens once and then that person fucks up and they're like, hey, listen, I contributed to a fucking toxic atmosphere. As a result, I want to modify some of my behavior so I don't repeat it again or whatever. Dude, fucking come back in. We all make fuck ups. We all say fucking crazy shit. We say crazy shit on this fucking panel. But if you see time after time after time after time, this person creates the toxic environment and then backs off when it's fucking when it's politically expedient or whatever. That's a pattern of behavior that has to be intentional, and I think that's what like a lot of us take issue with. And in particular, like this is kind of a weird conversation to have in reference to Mix, because the one thing I respect about her is she'll just say it. A lot of people will just fucking bounce around and be like, well, I'm not saying I...
Okay, sure, but that doesn't necessarily make it better, right? Like...
It makes it better to me, I'll tell you that.
Sure, but it would still be bad.
I would rather have an honest.
It's easy to call him out.
But when you mention that negligence thing, something you say is also, this is a big problem that I have with like Vosh, for instance. So like, this is somebody that will time and time again get something completely wrong, attribute all this malice, get the facts wrong over and over again, but then they'll come out like, you know, a week later and be like, oh, hey guys, just so you know, I was wrong about this thing, here's the actual thing that happened. When people do this over and over and over and over again, at some point you're like, okay, bro, like if we're not like at willful recklessness, like you're intentionally being like just stupid at this point. Like,
I think everything you just said is totally reasonable, but I just think that by any stretch, you should not have a problem then with the looseness of terrorism at times. You just said there are clear cases where someone like Vosh or Hassan might demonstrate reckless indifference, where it's very clear that in your mind that fits the bill. But for people like Facebook moms, it's less clear. That's the same thing with terrorism. They're both ambiguous and can be misused, both stochastic terrorism and regular terrorism, and you shouldn't differentiate your usage there and be more comfortable with stochastic terrorism.
Can I throw you an olive branch?
Well, here, hold on. I'll agree with him real quick, then you can say whatever you want, okay? So if we lived in a world where everybody was peace, and destiny, I'm probably okay with the word terrorist, okay? But the problem is that if I buy into your word of terrorism right now, and then I use that going forward, nobody, okay, less than 1% of Americans or people that would be on the left would support calling like BLM riots terrorist riots. Nobody would do it. Nobody would be comfortable saying that like Malcolm X engaged in domestic terrorism. Nobody would be comfortable saying that, right? Now, if everybody was comfortable jumping on board with saying like, okay, yeah, like there could be good forms of terrorism and bad forms of terrorism, which I believe if I was going to say terrorism was a thing, absolutely I would say there can be good informed bad terrorism, absolutely. But most people aren't willing to engage with that because it's a highly politicized definition.
So public and private positions is how we split the difference.
Hot.
Well,
okay,
sure.
So I want to offer you an olive branch too. If your concern is that we're being too loose with the word like terrorist or terrorism, and because of the context that this is coming down in, which is the global war on terror, where we've effectively militarized the entire globe specifically to kill terrorists, and you're worried that this rhetoric is going to come back and take a massive shit on us because
I'm worried about Destiny's too.
Terrorist. Right. Okay, hold on, but just real quickly, if you're worried that this rhetoric is going to come back and take a massive shit on us despite being definitionally correct, I agree with you.
I'm very concerned about like I'm very concerned about like us widening the definition of terrorism.
Yeah.
And then we can call people terrorists for things that didn't meet previous definitions of terrorism.
Yeah, but I don't like right now.
Dehumanize them, and then before you know it, the FBI is like, oh, well, that's stochastic. That's
Fabian said
terrorism.
It. Beautiful.
And like the FBI has every right to tap your phones, and the FBI has every right to fly footage over BLM protests and make sure that if you're there for more than an hour and they ping your cell phone there, that they can automatically put you and keylog you in their system. Oh wait,
so hold on, wait, real quick.
Was
anybody on this panel arguing that like legal definition should be brought in when we talk about stochastic terrorism?
No.
Okay, so not a single person here is in favor of like the FBI tapping people for stochastic.
When you were taking issue with the terrorism definition,
we've already seen how cultural changes of definition make their way to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court will use those definitions. We saw this with gender, right? Like we saw the way that they expanded the 14th Amendment to the LGBT was, instead of saying like, no, you need an actual change, in the Constitution, they're like, well, that would be too much.
That was an originalist opinion by Gorsuch, and you're saying that was, I don't know, well,
I'm just saying, like, even in the highest levels of court, right, you can see how the us changing the language, right, can be a way that the state can justify, right, not actually having to create new laws or circumnavigating the Constitution just by the changing of those things. So we don't need another Patriot Act if we start culturally using the term terrorism differently, because they can just say, well, like, this is what the term terrorism
Wait,
means,
but couldn't we just literally apply this to
way.
any new term we create to call out this thing that the state is going to make it illegal?
Happens all the time. We're calling what's happening in China right now with the Uyghurs a cultural genocide. Like, where did that word come from? What's the definition?
Wait, well, to be clear, we wouldn't call that a cultural genocide. We'd call that a genocide, right?
That's what you chose to enter with, was fucking.
No,
that's serious. So here's my.
It's the exact same situation. All they're doing is conditioning you for a response, right? Like, if that's what you're going to say,
okay, so then we can't.
The word terrorism.
We can't call out any bad thing ever, because at some point the state might do anything, I guess. Is it?
That's not the argument. I'm just saying, like, there's parallels.
So we can't have any sort of interpretation on any sort of term. We can't have any differentiation.
Why would I say that? Gappy,
versus what
why would I say something that's stupid? I'm not saying that.
I mean, it sounds like you're saying something that's stupid.
Terrorism is a very loaded word that could have more dangerous legal connotations and
then somebody invent a new word. Since half the problems on this panel seem to just be like the word. Find a new word for it then, and we can all just agree on that and move forward. I'm okay with that.
I mean,
the issue seems to literally just be a
Disco earlier. Right? It's like what word would you use for a situation?
If you want to call it like passive incitement to violence or something, I don't know. I mean, if you want to think,
I agree with Destiny that like this could be used to apply to any word, but the only reason it's relevant, Destiny, is because that was the reason you said not to use terrorism, is because of the societal implications of using it, and it's going to cause all sorts of problems and classifications that people won't agree with you.
Then just find a new term then. I don't know anything else that exists that describes like what stochastic terrorism is. I've heard the term stochastic terrorism. I've seen it explained, and I like the concept behind that. If you want to develop a new way, and then I'll try to make this my new word that I will use as other people use it.
Wait, hold on. You guys, can I ask you guys something you said, right, and not the term itself, which was the original topic. Like,
okay, but really quickly. So, do you guys think that someone like Hassan or Vash, right, people who are more concerned with pushing a particular movement or narrative than presenting reality about a specific case, do you think these kind of people should be allowed on the platform if there's some kind of some reason to believe that them doing this again and again and again might lead to riots and protests and violence?
Of course not. But then legally, that would be something called incitement. Right?
Well, we're not talking legally. I think he means like TOS, right?
Well,
yeah,
sure,
like
okay,
so if Hassan is I don't watch Hassan because I'm not brain dead, but I've heard what people have said about his coverage, and I think I saw like a tiny clip about him mentioning like Kyle being white or whatever the fuck, right? So if he's saying stuff like that about Kyle Rittenhouse, right, and he's streaming to tens of thousands of people every fucking day, right? If there's a chance that him doing this again and again and again, and implying that a white guy can just go out and murder people, and because the system's racist, it's totally fine, right? And he's going to get off. If we can acknowledge that can lead to terrorism, right? Should he be on the platform?
Sure, I would say that no. Like TOS, a lot of times are going to be like a simpler version or a more private version of whatever we would say is problematic. Like we're making laws against it because it's obviously something wrong, and so I'm sure TOS is going to probably want to make sure that what they're doing is legal already, right? So ultimately, somebody that's constantly doing something that's inciting violence, we would automatically.
So what about someone like Vash, who like immediately after the Jacob Blake shooting went out and said that it's totally unjustifiable. They're going to try to justify it anyway because of the racist.
Or any cop analysis he does, it's all the fucking same.
Yeah. So someone like this, should this person be on Twitch? Should Prime be on Twitch because they're bringing on Vivian, who's saying this crazy shit all the time? Or me, who some people say that I say crazy things sometimes.
Sure,
so if Prime is bringing these people on, right? Should he be on the platform?
It has to be really specific, right? Like when you want to start talking about stochastic terrorism, or stochastic terrorism, it's going to be like it's going to be a much harder thing to prove, right? So then at this point, it's because of how nebulous it is, it's going to be up to the individual creators to be able to say something, and they're probably going to need to find a little bit more strong of a connection other than the fact that someone is just wrong. Because the reason why I didn't push back against this earlier because everybody wants to go ham, but when Destiny gave his argument and I was trying to give a counter, it's anytime if I ever say that there's injustice within our criminal justice system, then by definition you could say I'm possibly a stochastic terrorist.
No.
Because at this point, if it's our criminal justice system and our legal system and our judicial system, right? And our Congress, right? Then at this point, the idea is if all of the powers that be have some form of systemic racism in there, then that means that these systems can embolden and empower themselves. So then that means it seems like the only
not under my definition. That's not, just don't invoke my definition because that's not what I said.
How are those things different?
My thing is when I said that if you say the only way to remedy these systems is through violence, that's when you've crossed the line.
It didn't say that explicitly. And what Fnatic is trying to explain is that you said that there's plausible deniability to it, that you don't have to see.
I never said anything. Well, hold on. I never said anything about plausible deniability ever. What do you mean?
You said that you didn't have to say it directly, and that you were looking for.
I said you don't have to say it directly, but when the only possible alternative is violence. So for instance, let's say Fanatic was saying that like, I think that there is systemic racism in our, sometimes even in our voting process. I think there's systemic racism in our policing. I think there's systemic racism all throughout our judicial system.
He believes that, I think.
Sure. Let's say that he said all of those things. I don't think he's established it yet. Now, if he were to go on and say things like, I don't think voting is going to do anything. Voting won't change anything. All of these systems are fundamentally broken. Nobody listens to you. Nobody cares about you. There's nothing you can do to change any of this shit. Then I think we've crossed the line. I was okay. Well, then we got to start killing people. That's literally the only alternative left, right? That's what I think the difference is.
Alternatives for the record,
or leave the country, or whatever. But so
I gave agorism. I gave dual power theory. I gave changing local situations. Right.
Okay, but
I think really what we should.
Oh no, sorry. Counter.
I was going to say, we have to recognize the power of speech, not just as a tool of radicalization, but also as a vent. So I think that's like an important thing, because like, so for instance, like if you were kind of, somebody, I think Doobie was asking like, should I be deplatformed? Should Destiny be deplatformed? Should everybody on this fucking panel be deplatformed? Because at some point in our lives, we advocated for some level of non-state violence and blah, blah, fucking blah. Okay. So the logical answer is yes, but then that seems too hyperbolic, right? So I think that the real stance has to be is like, we have to evaluate this from the perspective of, is this, going to use some utilitarian calculi, is this a vent, or is this contributing to more violence? Because if it's people bitching on the fucking internet, you don't want to tamp down on that, because then that's going to fucking froth over, become a volcano, and then eventually explode. You want to give people the ability to express controversial fucking ideas. That way they can get it out of their fucking system, and then that way they're less likely to act on those ideas.
That's a wonderful point. I think classic protected political hyperbole is like what Kathy Griffin did with Trump's head. And what you guys are essentially saying is,
though, right?
Well, what do you think? I mean, that's like classic. There's another LBJ one, a classic SCOTUS one.
No, I think
that's protected speech.
Hey, hold on real quick. We're going into, these are legal arguments now. I don't think anybody before was talking about making this illegal.
Oh, I don't mean illegal. I mean like as in terms of like part of the rhetoric of America about stuff that we've accepted as part, as not stochastic terrorism.
Okay, here's something that a lot of people aren't comfortable with for some reason, okay? There are consequences, there are negative consequences to the First Amendment. There are objectively bad things that happen as a result of freedom of speech. But all of us should be okay with that, right? Because we accept that we have a freedom of speech. Now, there are going to be some negatives, but we think the positives outweigh the negatives, right? So Snoop Dogg did some song where they shot basically Trump in the music video or whatever. And I don't know if this was challenged in court directly or not, but this is like, if there was ever going to be a First Amendment, arguably it's for something like this. But if somebody went out and killed Trump, and they were like a huge Snoop Dogg fan, it's pretty dishonest to say, well, hold on, I don't see at all how that could have ever influenced that person. It seems like it probably did. So we can argue that like, yeah, this is maybe a form of, we can say—
We don't analyze it at the time after it happened. We analyze it at the time Snoop Dogg made that video, because that's sarcastic terrorism.
Sure, we can even argue at the time it happens. Yeah, sure, that it might be a form that recic could be sarcastic terrorism. At the time it was made. Yes, we can absolutely say that, right? Sure, we can say that.
This is no, counter, you got to get modded above me. Let me go real quick. So this is again, like as Counter said, right? Like where we constantly end up in this ethical dilemma, right? Like I think what you should be doing is you should try not to call people loaded terms. You should call out their shitty ideas, right? And I think that's really the thing here when people talk about, well, should this person be deplatformed, or should this shit doesn't work. Right, like it becomes a problem. Like the more people you deplatform, the more you just encourage websites like fucking 4chan and Daily Stormer and like other fucked up places where people aren't exposed to opposing counter narratives. Right.
Wait, who's heard from Stefan Molyneux recently?
But the problem is their rhetoric.
I mean, Stefan Molyneux has a fairly decent following on BitChute. To be fair,
to be very clear.
But no, I mean, yeah, sure, he's lost some engagement, but
no, he's lost almost everything, right?
Right, but that didn't work for fucking Alex Jones, right? Like
it probably worked for him too.
He's probably mitigated it a fuck.
No, yeah, Alex Jones has absolutely lost a ton,
the problem, but then you start to getting into quantifying like what is the difference between someone having more ability to engage with his content, but then immediately going to the next YouTube video that's calling him out, and the difference between going to someone's website or going to their little dark corner. Like, have you seen the comments section in BitChute? Like every other fucking thing is like they, except they don't use they in quotation marks, right? Like, so like the issue here is like, when you start trying to group people and then separate them, instead of just attacking their shitty ideas, you get into this whole conundrum of probabilities and problems. What you should be doing is the exact opposite of what Destiny said, but the same thing at the same time, is that no, we don't accept the First Amendment because like we did a utilitarian calculus and said that some bad shit is acceptable. We accept the First Amendment because it's a principle, because it is a principle of free speech within Enlightenment values that we say that like as long as you're not calling for direct actionable violence, that you should be able to say whatever the fuck you want to say. Okay, this is like the SPLC got started defending the KKK, right? No. And why did they do that? Because they were fucking
because sorry, buddy.
No, but I'll just finish and I'll let you go, right? Like, why did they do that? Because they knew that it was better to call out those shitty ideas and to see those people with their fucking mask off. Counterpoints, if you love the idea of Vivian being mask off the whole time, then she needs to be on the platform so we can show people that follow her why these ideas are shitty.
Okay, yes and no, but here's the thing that I wanted to push back against very specifically. I think the First Amendment was a utilitarian calculus based off of the Founding Fathers. I think they said that when people cannot speak for themselves and they basically have to go around with like corrupt authority, what happens is that a society rots, and as a result, super negative shit happens over time. And the reason why
JS Mill was a utilitarian, like a famous one, right?
Right.
He wrote on liberty. So I mean, you could be right in that thing. But this is still a principle of our founding.
But what I want to say is like so for instance, like very specifically, like it was kind of interesting making a point that I think Pisco might have not have thought that I agreed with, but then we both agreed on it or whatever. Just because a lot of stochastic terrorism is legal. What Tucker Carlson does every single night is legal. He's allowed to express his opinion in that way, even if that opinion ultimately results in people radicalizing to the point that they think that they're being invaded, that the government is out to fucking get them, that they need to fucking line their fucking their insulation in their house with fucking tinfoil, and they need to fucking snub their Mexican neighbors. Like, that's legal. Whether or not it's good is a different fucking question, and whether or not we should call it out culturally is a different fucking question. And I think the answer is,
I'll agree.
I think calling it stochastic terrorism is perfectly fine, because we can basically, for me, the term stochastic terrorism, the reason why I like the weight behind it is because it says, hey buddy, we smell your fucking bullshit, we know what you're fucking poking at, and we know that you're poking at fucking evil shit. That's why I like the weight of the term, but I do have the government concerns that you were bringing up.
Okay, wait 1 second. To be very clear about what I meant, right, or what my position is. So I did mention Connor, Fnatic, Destiny, and Prime in my opening, right? So I think that all the examples that I gave, I think could reasonably be seen as like stochastic terrorism. But I think that
for state actors,
but I also think that, we all do a little stochastic terrorism sometimes.
But you too, right? You said yourself as well.
Me too. Me too.
Okay, the bar's way too low, guys. I mean, you just
consider the extent of it. That's why we consider the extent. Don't just get scared over somebody using the word terrorism.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't think that this term is that big a deal, right? But however, I think that if we're going to be pushing Facebook and Twitter and all these other social media platforms to moderate and to like regulate fake news and misinformation spreading on their platforms, I think it's reasonable to expect the same thing of Twitch when we have people like Hassan pushing fake news about really important news items that could lead to violence. If he's doing this repeatedly, and it's demonstrable that he's doing this repeatedly, I think it's totally fine to say, hey, this person probably doesn't need to be on the platform.
It's such a stretch. There's so much weight.
If somebody is repeatedly doing that type of back and forth shit, like if we look at Vosh and the shit that has been said with cops, and he's repeatedly going back and forth, and I know it's going to piss Pisco off, but if there is a pattern of conformity therewith, and we see that there is clear character evidence that time and time again they are acting within this trait, I think it's totally fine to take them off at this point. I think it's kind of stupid that we're basically waiting for the one singular moment that maybe they finally say something that's a lot more direct than circumstantial, and even though there's been so many other prior instances,
this is a policy implication.
We finally act.
Yeah, now this is a policy implication of what you're saying, and you're saying like essentially liars should be pushed off Twitch.
Yeah, that's
Well,
what I'm
the pattern of
So
conformity.
if we can demonstrate
and everything
that
that's
either
happening there.
that either they're outright lying or they don't care enough about the actual news item to be honest about it because they're more concerned about pushing like a particular narrative.
You're going to create balkanization.
This misinformation that they're pushing, right, might lead some people to react violently, right? Can you tell me why they shouldn't be a policy that says these people should be removed from the platform?
More balkanization. Right. You're going to start separating people, right? Like if you allow more and more corporate censorship, then what you do is you drive more and more people off the platform. Except these people have jobs and they have money too, right? And so they're going to want to go somewhere else for their type of content. Like Twitch is already overwhelmingly left-wing in the politics space, right? Like I don't think anyone really disagrees with that. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying it is what it is, right? So if you allow corporate censorship and it starts to take on a political bias, which it's made by humans, it's gonna, right? Like whether it be right-wing or left-wing, it's gonna have some bias. It's gonna put and especially when you have reporting mechanisms, right? And you have like you get this situation where it gets worse and worse. And what you're gonna have is you're gonna have competitors start popping up, and you're gonna have two.
I mean, I didn't really watch the whole panel. I only came in after I got a message from you actually saying that I was being talked about a lot, and it did seem like I got like super baked into the conversation. Like it's just like Vivian, the stochastic terrorist. Like, first off, I think we're kind of using I haven't heard academics use the term stochastic terrorist as in calling somebody a stochastic terrorist. Stochastic terrorism is more sort of a concept of like, for like lone wolf attacks and so on, is saying that this is an incidence of stochastic terrorism, that it's impossible to sort of blame any kind of hierarchical structure or individual, but we can blame basically a narrative that is being pushed in general that is likely to cause violence, even though you might not be able to predict how, who, where, whatever, right? That's the general idea around stochastic terrorism. That's me being picky though. If you want to like use it in a colloquial sense to say that somebody is like responsible for stochastic terrorism by contributing to one of those narratives, that's fine. I think I would probably only use that term if I was talking about like literal, like actual terrorist attacks, right? Rather than sort of like just general violence, rioting, because by saying somebody is a stochastic terrorist, you're saying that all rioters are terrorists, right? If you're saying they're responsible for the riots and the violence that goes on there.
I like how Vivian proves what I told Pisco.
At least the rioters that engage in violence there are terrorists. And I think we end up with a very sort of vague fucking definition of terrorist that I would not use, and a vague sort of definition of like who is a stochastic terrorist that seems kind of fucking nonsensical. I think it's much more useful rather than like essentializing to get to the core of the accusation, really, which is like, does your rhetoric encourage unjustified violence, right? Like, I think that would be the accusation, really, the core of it, that's actually a sensible moral critique.
Joe, you had thoughts, so here's a space to express them.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Vivian a lot. Obviously, one thing that I completely disagree with Pisco on is the idea that it's not useful post hoc. I think it's the only time it's useful. I don't think it's particularly useful calling individual people stochastic terrorists, largely because one of the best things about stochastic terrorism is silence, deniability, the ability to sort of dog whistle and say things and create an entire worldview that suggests a certain logic without ever necessarily explicitly calling for violence. And once
fantastic book, the international bestseller, Why We Sleep. It's Professor Matthew Walker. Matthew, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a delight to be chatting again. Lovely.
Yeah, Matt, we sort of first had contact over email, and we got to do a Facebook Live conversation on my Facebook page, which proved a huge hit with my audience. But, talking over Skype with technology, albeit fantastic, it isn't quite the same as being face-to-face here. So I'm delighted that you're over here now in London doing a bit of promotion for your book.
It's lovely to finally meet you in person, Rangan.
Yeah, it's superb. But I thought we might start just by asking you, how many days have you been in London now for?
I arrived on Saturday, so this is my 4th day.
Your 4th day. So look, at the moment it's about, well, we've probably just gone past 11 a.m. in the UK, which probably means, I'm guessing, it's about 3 a.m. in San Francisco. So what's going on with your body clock at the moment?
So you can't cure jet lag. There are no cures right now. But if you understand how it works, you sort of can hack the system a little bit. What we know is that for every day that you've been in a new time zone, your body can actually catch up by about 1 hour. So that sort of extra day basically acts like a set of fingers on a wristwatch, and it will just kind of tweak it 1 hour every day. So I am now 4 days in. I am only offset by 4 hours relative to California time. Normally, I'm offset by a total of 8 hours. I've been here 4 days, 1 hour for every day. I'm now 4 hours separated. That would be the classic case if you just sort of let passage of time work. However, you can speed up that sort of tweak. You can get those fingers to work harder on the wristwatch dial, sort of get closer and faster to the natural new time zone in the following ways. Firstly, you should get lots of daylight exposure in the morning in the new time zone. So whenever you arrive, and then for all of the days afterwards, make sure that you get about 20 to 30 minutes of natural daylight. It doesn't matter if it's cloudy, just that brightness alone is key. If you do go outside, the temptation is to put shades on. Don't do that. Even if it looks, you look fantastic and you look very cool. Just for the morning, all I would ask you is don't put shades on, because it will diminish that light reset function, because it's light that's going to help reset and fast forward that clock. The other critical thing is diet, or at least eating. Food is just as powerful a trigger for resetting your circadian rhythm as light is. We only discovered this probably about sort of 8 or 9 years ago. And so start eating meals at the regular times in the new time zone. Eat when everyone else is eating. Don't eat when your body tells you that you're hungry. It's harder to do, but that will help you get back into set as well. The other trick, however, is that if you go out in the afternoon, that's fine, no problem at all. But the afternoon is the time to wear shades. That's the time to start blocking the light, to start to force your body to think it's nighttime, it's darkness, even though your body clock, California for me, is just starting to wake up. I need to shroud my brain in darkness to try and help reset it. So bright light in the morning, get out in the afternoon, that's fine, but wear shades, and then lots of darkness at night. Eat meals regularly, and then try and exercise, usually in the morning if you can. If you do those 3 things, you can strategically treat jet lag. You can't cure it. You'll still feel a little bit miserable. The only other trick I would say is during traveling. I see a lot of people make the mistake of when they sleep during travel. It's very natural. If I'm flying over from San Francisco to London, usually leave around 5 p.m. in the evening. Most people, and let's say it's an 11-hour flight, most people will wait until the last sort of 4 or 3 hours and go to bed then and sort of sleep late. And I normally arrive about 11 o'clock in the morning, London time. That's not the ideal thing to do. Try to sleep on your flight, either early in the flight or in the middle of the flight. And the rule of thumb is make sure that whatever time of you want to go to bed in the new time zone that evening, let's say it's 10 o'clock, count back at least 12 hours or 10 hours. That's the time that you have to wake up on the plane and then stay awake. You need to build up lots of that healthy sleepiness for you to then fall asleep and stay asleep in the new time zone. Don't sleep too late into the flight. If it's late and you still haven't been sleepy, I would suggest forego sleep, which sounds strange from someone like me. Push through for the rest of the day and then just get to bed early and you'll get into set.
So thanks for sharing those tips in terms of how you have tried to combat jet lag. But what's interesting as I hear them is that some of the tips are actually pretty similar to the recommendations you would make to people who are not crossing time zones, but are just simply trying to improve their quality of sleep. So we'll get into that in just a few moments. I actually am doing that flight to California relatively regularly these days, maybe 3 to 4 times a year. And 2 weeks ago I went and I tried something different for the very first time. And I've got to say, I had the least jet lag I've ever had on one of my trips to California. And, I changed multiple variables. It's very hard to say which one exactly it was. But on the flight out there, so it was a morning flight from London, so that would be the middle of the night in California, I put on some blue light blockers on the flight. And blue light blockers for a little bit of time, and I was reading, but then I would close my eyes. I put a shade on my eyes, and I would just try and sleep. I couldn't sleep that well, but at least I didn't expose myself to light. Then at the time of morning, or what would have been morning in California, I took off my nightshades. I did not put on my blue light blockers, and I actually watched a film. So I was exposing myself to blue light from my screen to sort of trick my body, say, hey, you're on morning time. So I've never done that before. The other thing is, and I think we'll go here next, the other thing I've done a lot recently is reduce my caffeine intake a lot. And I think that often when I used to travel, I was so habituated to having caffeine that sometimes I would wake up in the new time zone with a bit of a headache because my body was expecting caffeine earlier. It didn't have it. And I think that was artificially waking me up. So, a few things I did differently. But, caffeine is such a popular topic, right? And we don't want to be, start off this conversation on a downer. But, let's go into caffeine. And how much of a sleep disruptor is caffeine?
I mean, it is quite significant, and one of the problems, with those long haul flights, and I would actually love to speak with, Virgin or British Airways about this. They serve caffeine liberally.
Yeah.
And the other thing they serve is alcohol, and I'd love to speak about that too, because both of those are the very best ways to A, disrupt your sleep, and B, actually make it much harder for your 24-hour biological circadian clock to readjust. Both of them, those will actually take away those fingers on the wristwatch and sort of or slow the progression down. But caffeine is a misunderstood drug. Certainly,
it's a drug, right? You use the term drug, and that's interesting.
It is a drug. It's what we call a psychoactive stimulant. Everyone knows that caffeine can help alert you and sort of keep you awake. That's the thing that's most known. Caffeine, if you look at some data, is probably the second most traded commodity on the surface of the planet after oil, which I think says everything about our sleep-deprived state. The other thing about caffeine, however, that most people don't realize is the time that it is in your system. So most drugs have what we call a half-life, the amount of time it takes for half of that drug to be essentially excreted out your system. Caffeine has a half-life of about 6 or 7 hours, and it's a little dependent on what type of gene that you have to sort of metabolize the caffeine, but on average, it's about that. But what's interesting is that caffeine has a quarter life of about 12 hours. What this means is that if you have a cup of coffee at noon, a quarter of that caffeine is still circulating around your brain at midnight. Wow. So to put that in context, it would be the equivalent of getting into bed, and just before you turn the light out, you swig a quarter of a cup of Starbucks and you hope for a good night of sleep. You would never do that because, but that's exactly, unfortunately, what people do, completely innocently by drinking caffeine, still too late in the afternoon.
Yeah, it's a huge problem.
I think it's a big problem in society. Another way to quantify this is if you just look, and I've checked out the data from the Financial Times, the number of Starbucks coffee houses that have arisen over the past 30 years is just like an exponential increase. And I think that is an expression of how we're self-medicating our state of sleep deprivation in developed nations.
Well, cafe culture is just growing it, exponentially now, right? It's the new, I talk about something, it's almost like a new pub culture. It's cafe culture.
Yeah.
You hang out with your friends, you meet up, you get your drink. Typically, it'll be a caffeinated drink.
Yeah.
We've now got school kids. I saw in a local village I was walking through recently, after school, I popped into a cafe to get, I think, a bottle of water. I can't really remember, but I popped in and I saw a group of school kids. They must have been maybe 13 or 14 after school. They're sitting in the cafe with their caffeinated drinks, doing their homework together, catching up, whatever. I thought, wow, this has become endemic in society now. You call it a drug. I agree with you. It is a psychoactive substance that we use liberally. We let our children have it. We're not even, we often don't think about the implications of that. And so many patients of mine tell me that, Dr. Chachi, I know, if caffeine can be a problem for some people, I'm not one of those. Caffeine is fine for me. But more often than not, when they either reduce their intake or cut it out completely, the sleep quality goes up.
Yeah.
And Sachin Panda, Professor Panda, who, I know very well, you both sort of follow each other's research. He was on the podcast a few weeks ago, and he was saying routinely every year he will have a bit of a detox from caffeine. He'll go off caffeine. And he says, when I do that, I have a headache for a few days, but my sleep always improves. I've got more energy, and my productivity dramatically increases. And I think that says it all, really.
It does. And a number of points that you made that I'd love to circle back around to. Firstly, caffeine is the only psychoactive stimulant that we do give to our children readily, which, is, I think, a concern. And I'm not trying to be sort of, finger pointing or finger wagging. Again, I think it's just that parents probably don't understand the impact of caffeine in that regard. I think the second point comes on to your comment of some people say, look, I'm one of those people who can drink a cup of coffee in the evening, have an espresso after dinner, and I fall asleep fine and I stay asleep. Now, even if that's true, there was an alarming study that was done where they gave people just one single cup of coffee, a dose of 200 milligrams of caffeine, standard cup of coffee. And then they measured the quality of their deep sleep by tracking these big, powerful brain waves, these glorious, beautiful deep brain waves that bathe all of our brain during deep sleep at night, and it helps also restore the body. And what they found was that just one dose of caffeine in the evening decreased the amount of deep sleep by 20%. Now, you would have to normally age by about 15 years to produce that type of a deficit in your deep sleep, or you can do it every single night by having a cup of coffee. And what's interesting is that those people will wake up the next morning. They won't remember waking up because they may not have woken up, but the quality of their deep sleep was so poor that they will still then feel unrestored and unrefreshed by their sleep.
I need more caffeine.
And so here is the irony, that now they're starting to reach for 2 cups of coffee rather than 1, and so develops this dependency cycle, this sort of addiction spiral, as it were. So I think people are perhaps unaware of the true impact of caffeine, how long it sticks around within your system, and even if you feel that you're immune to that evening cup of coffee, how it will still impact your sleep, even though consciously you know nothing about it.
Well, I think, you raised a really important point there, Matthew, about, knowledge and awareness. None of us are pointing fingers. I understand caffeine is everywhere. I probably used to overdrink caffeine, and I've altered my behavior as I've learned more and more about the research. And I think what we're trying to do is raise awareness of, caffeine is a sleep disruptor. There's just no question about that. And, we can dress it up any way we want, but it is a sleep disruptor. So if anyone is listening to this, if that story that Matthew just mentioned resonates with you, I'd really sort of encourage you to have a little think about your caffeine usage and just see if can you wind it down a little bit? Can you see, bit by bit, if by reducing it, it improves your quality of sleep? The recommendation I make in my book is enjoy your caffeine before noon. And I say enjoy because I get it. People love it. Right? I love a good cup of coffee, but I will not have caffeine after midday.
Yeah, and I've now actually done what Sachin has done. I routinely go through sort of a caffeine detox. And right now I'm caffeine free. But, I too would enjoy that cup of coffee or a nice strong cup of, Yorkshire tea. I have no relationship with them, by the way, in the mornings. And I also love the coffee culture as well. I go out with friends and we grab coffee all the time. And I love that. And I want people to embrace it because I think it's fantastic that there's a social movement sort of circulating around that. All I would say, though, is that, decaffeinated coffee is actually really quite good. And I would struggle, I'd love to do the sort of, the Coke Pepsi challenge with decaf and caffeinated. Just in terms of the taste, you will probably notice that it wouldn't give you sort of the shakes or that sort of slightly anxious state. And you probably know the difference. But I've really become enamored with decaffeinated coffee in all of its flavors, and I love the cafe bar culture. So love to embrace that. But I do like what you're saying about sort of patience, just thinking a little bit about caffeine and considering it, and just try the experiment. Sort of set yourself the task, give it a go, and see if it works for you.
Yeah, I remember about a month after my book came out, someone tweeted me and said, I never ever thought that caffeine was a problem for me, but I've read your book, I've taken your recommendation, I now only have 2 cups of coffee and I have it before noon, and I've never slept this well in over 30 years. And it's just incredible how such a common thing that people are doing day to day may be impacting our sleep. And I think you make a really good point that it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more caffeine you drink, the more you need, the more dependent you become, the less good your sleep is. And it just continues. I think we also have to highlight, we're talking about coffee, but I think tea would be similar because it contains caffeine. Green tea, a herbal tea that often people switch to when they're not having tea or coffee, is also a highly caffeinated drink, so may affect you. You mentioned decaf coffee. I've read some reports are saying that decaf coffee does contain some caffeine. Do you know much about that?
So decaffeinated coffee is not no caffeinated coffee. So you do have to be, somewhat mindful of that. And they looked, and you can sort of search around on the internet. There's some good sites that will describe exactly how much. Some brands have very little caffeine at all. Other brands, however, I was surprised to find can have up to 20% caffeine in. So you have 5 cups of those, and you're well on your way to a standard cup of coffee. So you do have to be a little bit careful. But it's certainly a good way if you're thinking about trying to come off caffeine, to sort of psychologically still treat yourself with that pleasure.
And it tastes great, right?
Yeah, it does. It really, it's not too bad.
So caffeine is something that a lot of us do in the morning. We're also going to talk a little bit later about alcohol, which is something that people often use in the early evening or late evening to help them unwind for bed. But before we go deep into alcohol, because I think that's something that people are incredibly fascinated about, because I think that whole term of a nightcap, people, it's there in our vernacular now, how it's something that can help you just slip off into sleep. Or can it? We'll find out shortly. But, listeners to my podcast know that I talk about these 4 key pillars of health that I think have the most impact on the way that we feel, but also that we've got some degree of control over. Food and movements, which people have been talking about for years, but also sleep and relaxation. Now, in your book, right at the start, you make a very powerful case why sleep is the foundational pillar of health. I'd love you to talk more about that.
Yeah, I used to think that sleep may be the 3rd pillar of good health alongside diet and exercise. But the more I sort of did my research and the more I read from other people, I realized I was probably wrong, that in fact sleep is the foundation on which those 2 other things sit. And I'll give you an example in each. Firstly, for diet and exercise, we know that if people are trying to lose weight and they're being judicious about their food intake, they're trying to diet, but they're not getting sufficient sleep, 70% of all the weight that they lose will come from lean muscle mass and not fat. Wow. Because your body becomes very stingy in giving up its fat when you are underslept. So dieting becomes, quite redundant in that regard. You want to keep the muscle, you want to let go of the fat, and sleep deprivation will do the opposite to you. So that's the first thing. It's a foundational element on which, nutrition sits. And by the way, I'd love to talk all about sort of diet, appetite, sort of increased caloric intake, increase in exactly what you desire to eat when you're underslept. There's great data there. But let me move over to activity. We've spoken about the foundation on which diet sits. When you are not sleeping sufficient amounts, firstly, the likelihood that you will actually exercise decreases significantly. Your motivation to be physically active drops away. Even if you are physically active, the intensity of your workout will not be as strong, so it's less effective and less efficient. Things like your vertical jump height, your muscle contraction strength, even the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen in your respiratory systems, they get worse when you haven't slept. Wow. What's even more frightening, however, is that your risk for injury increases when you are exercising but not well slept.
This is incredible.
And they did a great study where they looked at some athletes across a season, and then they tracked their sleep. And then they bucketed those athletes into the different amounts of sleep, 9 hours, 8 hours, 7 hours, 6 hours. What they found was a linear relationship between less and less sleep and increasing risk for serious injury during a sports event. So there is yet another demonstration of how even if you're trying to be physically active but not getting sufficient sleep, it can be harmful. The beauty of that part of the relationship, and the same for diet, is that it's bidirectional. That if you actually, improve your sleep, you can improve those two things. But conversely, those two things will improve sleep. Yeah. So if you start to correct your diet, you start to sleep better. We've already spoken about caffeine. But physical activity is a great way to enhance both the quality and the quantity of your deep sleep. So physical activity, as long as it's not too close to bedtime, if it's too close, your metabolic rate stays too high, your core body temperature stays too high, and that will prevent sleep.
I'm seeing that a lot as well, and I've experienced that myself in terms of squash is one of my favorite games. But if I play squash at about 7 or 7:30 p.m., I can't sleep that night. I'm lying in bed at night. I know it's about 5-ish for me, really is the last time I can go on the squash court, have a great workout, have an enjoyable game, and everything seems to have sort of gone back down to normal before I try and sleep at night. And I'm seeing that a lot with patients, which again, if people are after work, they're trying to fit their workout in, it becomes challenging because the modern world is making it sometimes quite tricky for us to live in harmony with our natural circadian rhythms.
Yeah.
But I see that a lot. Working out intensely in the evening is a problem. Have you done research on that in your lab?
So we've looked at this with body temperature too, and I understand that people, I still want to celebrate and embrace the idea of people exercising. I think that's critical. And even if it's late into the night, best not to do that. But if you do that, a good way to try and solve the higher core body temperature is to have a bath or a shower right before bed. And
a hot bath, right?
A hot bath is best, or a hot shower, because what happens is that all of the blood comes to the surface of your skin. You kind of get nice rosy cheeks. And that acts like this huge thermal radiator, taking all of the heat out of the core of your body. And as a consequence, the core body temperature will actually plummet and you will fall asleep easier. That's the reason that it's always easier to fall asleep in a room that's too cold than too hot. Too cold is taking you in the right temperature direction for good sleep. So if you do have to work out at some point late into the night, you can try that trick. But for the most part, try and get your workout in a little bit earlier.
It's a great tip, though, for people, because I know there'll be many people listening to this who probably do try and get their workouts in the evening. So that's a great little tip that they can put into practice to see if they can, ensure that workout doesn't hinder their ability to get good sleep. As you were talking about vertical jump, and as a sportsman myself, I sort of, this really, gets me excited to think, actually, can you improve your performance by sleeping more? And
oh my God, what?
Immediately what came into my head is an interview. I think it was an interview. Maybe I heard this comment. I mean, you may know more about this, but I have heard that Roger Federer may get, I think he's been on record to say he gets 12 hours of sleep a night. I don't know if that's true or not. Have you heard about that at all?
Yeah. So he does. He gets about 12 hours of sleep. And if you look at lots of sports athletes, LeBron James, the basketball player, he suggests that he gets somewhere between 10 and 11 hours. He splits that. He has a nap routinely during the day of about an hour and logs about sort of 9 to 10 hours at night. Usain Bolt, he says he never gets anything less than 9 hours. And I believe for one of his world records, he had only been awake for about 35 minutes because he'd taken a nap.
Oh, I love it.
Right before, I think it was an Olympic gold and a world record that he broke. And he had only been awake for about 35 minutes because he'd slept. And, this is what, I do some consulting now for some Premier League football teams as well as NBA, NFL in the United States, because they're starting to realize that sleep is probably the greatest legal performance enhancing drug that you could ever wish for. And it's not just in terms of preparation for exercise, by the way, for which it is spectacular. It's also about recovery. And that's one of the places where I see a lot of their sports physios perhaps not recognizing what they can do with sleep. They front load it out before the game, which is great. But often when teams are playing, they're playing multiple games. It's about a season, and it's all about maintaining their players' health. And that recovery period after a game before you play the next game is key. Players will dive into bath.
Der er et klip af en dude. Han har haft syge balls. Der er et klip af en dude i Wetlands, som der kommer i PvP, fordi en rogue har mind-controllet det mob, han står og slår på, og så dræber rogen ham. Det er the fucking dårligste stil.
Of ice to try and reduce swelling and inflammation. Sleep is a critical part of that sports equation. You need sleep on both sides of that. So it's fascinating. I say it just for people who are, really interested in being physically active, maintaining their peak performance. Make sure that you also consider sleep after being physically active as well.
When we talk about peak performance, everyone's looking for peak performance these days. Of course, those guys are athletes, right? So their idea of peak performance is probably, when Roger Federer is playing in a Grand Slam tennis match, he wants to be operating at peak performance. But, Joe Public also wants peak performance in their lives. They want to be able to wake up feeling refreshed, maybe get their kids to school without there being a whole load of arguments at home because everyone's underslept and tired.
Yeah.
They want to get to work and perform well in their job, so they feel that they're contributing to whatever work they're doing. They're operating at a high level. So, some people may think, Roger Federer, LeBron James, sure, great for those guys, but, I don't need as much sleep as them. So my question would be, what can we learn from those guys then in terms of how they prioritize sleep? How much sleep do we need every day? But also, in episode 14 of this podcast, it was a few episodes ago, I interviewed Nick Littlehales, who for many years has been advising clubs like Manchester United, the England football team, and he talks about this idea of 90-minute sleep cycles. I don't know if you've read his book or you're familiar with this recommendation, but I find it, he talks about this whole idea of 5 90-minute cycles that we need throughout the day. And I know some people found that quite helpful to take the pressure off them at night. So quite a few questions there, Matt, but I wonder if we could try and go into those areas a little bit.
Yeah, so right now the recommendation is for most adults, get 7 to 9 hours of sleep. And to get 7 hours of sleep, you probably need at least a 7.5 hour sleep opportunity. I think that's what many people miss in recommendations from sort of experts. They say, get your 7 hours of sleep. So people think that means, well, if I go to bed at, 11 p.m. and I wake up at 6 a.m., then I've got my 7 hours of sleep. That's not true. You probably will have only logged about sort of 6 hours and 40 minutes, and that's not enough. So you need to think about the sleep opportunity time as being probably around about 8 hours optimally. What we also know is that once you get below 7, we can start to measure objective impairments in your body and in your brain as well. The problem is that most people don't realize that they're sleep deprived when they're sleep deprived. This is a big problem with sleep loss. And, the analogy, I guess, would be a drunk driver at a bar. They've had a couple of pints, maybe a few shots, and they pick up their car keys and they say to you, look, I'm fine to drive home. And you say, no, I know that you think you're fine to drive home, but trust me, you're not. You are objectively, you're impaired. It's the same way with a lack of sleep, that our subjective sense is a miserable predictor of objectively how well we're doing with a lack of sleep. And I think that's one of the issues that I try to sort of help dismiss in terms of a notion. I think the other thing that's problematic too about getting too little sleep is that your baseline level of how you think your health and your wellness is just becomes chronically low, and you accept that as if that's just where I am in life. This is just me. This is as good as it can be. And people don't realize that if you're to change something like sleep or stress or diet or physical activity, there's actually a better form of you waiting on the other side of those things. Absolutely. It just requires perhaps, some knowledge and an invitation to go there.
Matthew, I call this podcast Feel Better, Live More for a reason. And it really just echoes what you just said then. When we feel better by, prioritizing sleep, by, looking at these other pillars that I talk about, we get more out of life. We're a better version of ourselves. We have better relationships. We have much deeper, more meaningful interactions with the world around us when we're feeling better. And I guess you would argue that when we sleep better, we live more.
We do. I mean, firstly, that data is very clear that if you look across epidemiological studies, millions of individuals in these studies, a very simple truth comes out, which is that the shorter your sleep, the shorter your life. That short sleep predicts all-cause mortality.
Wow.
And so, I think
we just need to stop and just let that sink in for a minute. Depriving ourselves from sleep will shorten our life.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean...
That's the powerful data that, the global sleep loss epidemic that is underway right now, which I believe is probably one of the greatest public health challenges that we now face in the 21st century, it is a slow form of self-euthanasia.
It's a very powerful statement, one that I absolutely would agree with. Have we, as a society, I don't know if over-prioritise is the right words, but yeah, let's go with over-prioritise. Have we put too much focus on the right food and the right physical activity at the expense of sleep?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've thought about this a lot. I don't think we've done it at the expense of sleep, perhaps, but I do resonate with your comment that I think sleep has perhaps been the neglected stepsister in the health conversation of today, and I think it's been left out in the cold. There's probably a number of reasons for that. The first is just because scientists like me are to blame. What I mean is that we have not adequately communicated to the public or to medicine or to healthcare professionals in general how critical the importance and necessity of sleep is. And I liken where we are with sleep with where we were for smoking 50 years ago. All of the science was there, but it hadn't trickled down into the public knowledge base or even into medicine.
Well, that's what you do so great with your book, is you're bringing that awareness to the general public all over the world, which is fantastic.
And that was part of the motivation for the book. I could see the disease and sickness and ill health that was caused by insufficient sleep. And there wasn't, there wasn't a blueprint guide. There wasn't some kind of a manifesto for sleep. And so that was part of the reason to write the book. But I think to come back, to why sleep is being left out in the cold, I think part of it is people like, well, at least my fault. I think the other thing too is that unlike diet and exercise, sleep has an image problem. I think nobody feels ashamed about saying, I went out for a run at lunchtime, or, I had a great run this morning. Nobody necessarily feels ashamed about, putting salad on their plate, and making a really healthy meal. But I do think people feel sometimes ashamed by saying, well, I need at least 8.5 hours of sleep a night. And sometimes I've heard the reaction of people saying, really? And that really has a hint in it to suggest that if you're getting sufficient sleep, and I choose that word carefully, sufficient, then you must be lazy, that you're slothful. Because we've tagged and we've associated this thing called necessary sleep with that luggage of, something to be ashamed about. And in fact, if anything, what happens is that people have this braggadocio attitude, this almost sort of sleep machismo attitude, that you're very proud to tell people how little sleep that you're getting, as though it's, a badge of honor. I see that in some people, not all people, but some people. So I think to change that part of the sleep discussion and bring it into the health equation, we need to destigmatize sleep in a way too. I think those are at least two of the reasons why it's being left out in the cold.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've shared this before on the podcast that a few years ago, for me, it was probably when I had kids, actually, because my kids were early risers, and, that's the understatement of the year, that they were early risers. But I realized that if I didn't alter my going to bed time, I was going to be exhausted every single day, which is what was happening. And I sort of altered my whole sleep schedule a few years back, and it's something now that I really do prioritize. I will have a shut-off time in the evening, after which I'm not on my computer, I'm not working. I will wait, because I know that if I don't do that, the next day I won't be performing anywhere near the level I want to. And it actually reminds me of that Facebook conversation we had, the Facebook Live chat we did.
Yeah.
So guys, we were trying to schedule this chat for a little while, and
I love this. Yeah.
We put a date in, and then Matthew had to move the time, and I got an email, I think, from your publicist saying, can we move this time? And I thought, well, that's 9 p.m. UK time. Man, that's really late, because I've just written a book saying how important sleep is as well, and I'm trying to educate and inspire my audience that actually these things are really important. So I actually declined your very kind invitation to do it at 9 p.m.
I just actually asked to see if we could change the time.
Yeah, you probably didn't know.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't have suggested.
Yeah, I said, guys, look, if we chat between 9 and 10, and we talk about how detrimental sleep is, and and all the problems associated with it, yet we're doing it late in the evening for my UK audience. I'm going to expose everyone to blue light in the evening, right, on their devices, emotionally work them up before bed. I thought, actually, you know what? Let's just decline that and do it at another time. So I thought that was quite nice. Yeah, that was great, wasn't it?
It was just, for someone to embrace, sort of and practice what they preach, and and I think for the two of us, a lot of people, of course, will ask me, well, so how much sleep do you get? And I will tell them that I do honestly get a non-negotiable 8-hour sleep opportunity every night. I'm not trying to be, a poster child for sleep. I'm not trying to just sort of promote the book. If you knew the data as I do, and as I hope people will after reading the book, honestly, you just would not choose to do anything else. And, I don't want to live a shorter life, and I don't want to live a shorter life that is filled with disease or sickness. And from everything I can tell, sleep is perhaps one of the most democratic, freely available, efficacious forms of health insurance that you could ever wish for. And as a consequence, the reason I get that much is because for selfish reasons, I just want to be alive and well for as long as possible. And I think, it's interesting hearing you say why you prioritize it. Again, it's selfish is the wrong word, but it's for self-preservation reasons. And one of the things I actually, if you don't mind, I know this is your podcast and you're interviewing me, but
talk about whatever you want.
But I would love to just ask you the question, because when I saw the title of the book, and I saw that there on the front cover was this word called sleep. And it was
on my book.
on the front cover of your book. Yeah. There was this thing called sleep: relax, eat, move, and sleep. And I well imagine that the first three would be there, of course, from an eminent clinician. But I was surprised by the fourth. I was lovely excited. It was wonderful. But tell me, where did that decision come from to include sleep? Where did you get the awareness from? Where did you get the sensitivity to sleep? Was it boots on the ground with patients? Was it in a medical curriculum? Was it personal? Tell me. I'd love to know.
Yeah, I think, Matthew, it's a great question, really. I mean, I guess my journey into this, of really being keen to promote lifestyle, comes from a real feeling that in medicine we've lost our way a little bit. Now, I'm not putting blame on anyone, but I sort of feel that the medical system is set up around acute diseases, acute problems that respond very well to our magic bullet pharmaceutical interventions. But I think the health landscape, even in my career, and I've nearly been seeing patients now for about 20 years, even in my career, I have seen the health landscape of the patients that I see change dramatically. Whereas now the bulk of what I see in my daily practice, I say 80% of it is in some way driven by our collective modern lifestyles. And so I've been delving deep for a few years now in terms of, what are those lifestyle factors that I can leverage with my patients to get a better outcome. And of course, when I first started going on this journey, it was all about food, right? It was like, okay, it's all about diet, and if we were having this chat 5 or 6 years ago, I would be saying, most of what happens to us, most of our health determinant is basically foods. But I disagree now, because I think when you know the science, when you have seen the science, as you detail so beautifully in your book, the case is compelling. You can't really ignore sleep. So I'm a doctor who wants to get my patients better, like every other doctor. I want to do this in as harmless a way as possible. And I also get very tired of suppressing downstream symptoms. So I want to go upstream as far as possible, see what lever can I turn that's going to have all these downstream consequences. And food is one of those things that, food isn't just calories, it's not just fat and carbs, it's information. It changes our genetic expression. So it's information for the body. In a similar way, physical activity can change hormones, can change genetic expression, all these kind of things. And, so obviously that's food, that's movement. Relaxation is a whole piece about stress, which, some research is showing that up to 90% of what we see in primary care may have stress as a factor, which is incredible. But I always felt I was missing. That's movement. Relaxation is a whole piece about stress, which, some research is showing that up to 90% of what we see in primary care may have stress as a factor, which is incredible. But I always felt I was missing one piece off the puzzle. And, I would see, like if we take autoimmune disease as an example, when I see my patients, I often do what's called a timeline. And I look, I say, okay, you've got symptoms here today, but let's look at your whole life. Let's see what's been happening sequentially, because I don't think a lot of these conditions just happen overnight. There's been a build-up for a period of time, for a period of years. And I would often see with autoimmune conditions that, just a few months, sometimes just 1 month before the onset of symptoms, I would see either not either. I would often see a really stressful episode happen that would reduce the quality of people's sleep, and then I see symptoms come on.
Yeah.
Now, as a doctor, I always want to learn from my patients. So, your question is, where does this come from? Well, primarily it's come from listening to my patients and listening to the stories that they tell me. Because, you're, one of the world's eminent researchers in sleep. I love research, but I also love real life, what happens at the coalface when I'm seeing patients. What did they tell me is working? What did they tell me they're struggling with? That also influences a lot of my recommendations, as well as the science. If you can marry those two together, I think that's when we can make a real difference with people. And I also went to a conference in San Diego about 2 years ago, and the whole conference was on sleep and relaxation and rest. And I think it was Phyllis Zay. Do you know Phyllis?
Phyllis C. Yeah.
Phyllis C.
Yeah.
She gave a couple of keynotes there. And I thought, God, this really is whetting my appetite. It's really reinforcing what I'm seeing in my practice. As I say, when you look at the research, I thought, well, how can I write a lifestyle book that is to empower people to take control of their health and not cover sleep? I can't do it. I just can't do it.
So interesting about that is, you had, all of this time at medical school in practice, and it took a conference, that you, through your own sheer interest and desire
my own
to try
money,
and
my
help,
own sort of annual leave to go and do this stuff because I'm interested.
That's where you got your sleep education. And, that strikes me as so, unfortunate. I want to work with medical systems to try and increase, a sleep education component, because wouldn't it be wonderful if all of our primary care physicians here in the United Kingdom were, as sleep aware and sleep motivated as you are? And I'm sure they would be delighted to receive that information. I have lots of friends here who are doctors, and I know that they would embrace that and would love to try and increase wellness in their patients, but there's just no pathway that we've engineered in the medical system to gift them with that knowledge and dispense wellness to their patients, because sleep really is the tide that raises all of the other health boats. It's just as you said, it's the superordinate node that if you manipulate it, it's like the Archimedes lever, you pull that, everything else can start to come into play.
Yeah, you get the sleep better. It affects your brain, it affects your hormones, it affects your genetic expression, it affects all these sort of things that we might be looking for drugs to affect those individual pathways, but you can improve a lot of them by improving your sleep.
Yeah, and it's we think, well, that sounds almost too good, but don't forget, it took Mother Nature 3.6 million years to evolve this necessity of 8 hours of sleep in place, which I should note, by the way, that if you look at the data, back in the 1940s, the average adult was sleeping about 7.9 hours of sleep. Now that number here in the United Kingdom is closer to 6 hours and 30 minutes. In other words, within the space of 100 years, which is a blink of an evolutionary eye, we've lopped off almost 20% of our sleep need. How could that not come with demonstrable health and disease consequence? So I think, there's that component there, but I love what you were saying that, in medicine, we're often, or even in research and pharmaceuticals, we're often trying to sort of manipulate one pathway in one area of the metabolic system, or one aspect of the immune system, or one feature of the cardiovascular system. And, sleep affects all of those. And we can, I'll give you an example. Firstly, we know that if you get a patient and you have them sleeping just 6 hours for 1 week, this is someone, let's say, who is healthy. At the end of that 1 week of short sleep, their blood sugar levels are disrupted so significantly that they would be pre-diabetic, that you would diagnose them as being in a state of pre-diabetic.
Just from sleep deprivation.
Just from sleep deprivation, when you control all of the factors. You can also speak about sleep loss and the cardiovascular system. And all it takes is 1 hour of lost sleep, because there is a global experiment that's performed on 1.6 billion people across 70 countries twice a year, and it's called daylight savings time. And it turns out that when you look at that data, in the spring, when we lose an hour of sleep, we see a subsequent 24% increase in heart attacks as a result.
It's just incredible.
But in the autumn, when we gain an hour of sleep, we see a 21% reduction in heart attacks.
So the data's there on a global level, isn't it? Just from that.
Is striking, and you can even think, you speak a lot about, the immune system. It's so key for our health.
So tell us, what does sleep do for the immune system?
So firstly, we can look on both sides of the coin. What happens when we don't get enough sleep? Firstly, we know that people who are sleeping 5 hours a night are 4 times more likely to catch a cold than those people who are sleeping 8 hours or more.
Wow.
Striking study, very well controlled study. We also know that it doesn't take 1 week of, short sleep deprivation. 1 night is enough. What we've found is that if you take healthy individuals and then we limit them to just 4 hours of sleep for 1 single night, what we see is a 70% drop in critical anti-cancer fighting immune cells called natural killer cells, which are these wonderful sort of immune assassins that, help decrease our, cancer risk.
Yeah. And help us fight infections.
And fight infection.
Part of our innate immune system.
Exactly. Part of that critical innate immune response. Flip the sort of the side of the coin. And now what we find is that when you get sleep, there is a change in what we call the autonomic nervous system, which is sort of this automatic part of our nervous system. And that automatic nervous system is split into 2 branches. One that is sort of like the accelerator pedal that gets us revved up, triggers the fight or flight response. The other is the brake that sort of calms us down. And when we go into deep sleep, we apply that brake to the nervous system and everything quiets down. Heart rate decreases. Deep sleep is the most wonderful form of natural blood pressure medication that you could ever wish for.
Yeah.
But one of the other things is that we see as that nervous system quiets down, levels of things like cortisol drop down, that stress-related chemical. And it's during that time that the body goes into an immune stimulation mode. And it's where essentially you're going to restock the armament of your immune army so that when you wake up the next day, you can battle and fight infection. What's also fascinating, and I love this data, and this tells you just how critical sleep is to a fighting for our health. If you look at people who become infected, or you actually infect them in the experimental laboratory, let's say with sort of a cold vaccine, or you immediately trigger increased sleepiness and increased amounts of deep sleep. And it turns out that the infection indicates to the immune system that you're under attack, and the immune system will actually signal to the sleep system within the brain, we need more sleep. Sleep is the best battle force that we have right now to combat this assault. And so that's why when you're sick, all you tend to want to do is just curl up in bed and go to sleep. The reason is because your body is trying to sleep you well.
It's an appropriate response to what's going on, right?
Exactly.
The bodies are pretty clever, right?
They are remarkably clever. Again, Mother Nature has figured this out. And so she brings up this thing called sleep, which I would argue is probably like the Swiss Army knife of health. Whatever ailment you are facing, it is more than likely that sleep has a tool in the box to try and help fight it.
That's so key. Whatever ailment you're facing, guys, if you listen to this, whatever you're suffering from, whether it's lack of energy on a day-to-day basis, whether it's that you're worried about your risk of developing a chronic disease such as type 2 diabetes or heart problems as you get older, what Matthew is saying, what Professor Walker is saying is that sleep, improving your quality of sleep, is going to help you with all these different facets. It's going to help reduce your risk. It's going to help increase your energy. It's also going to reduce your risk of actually getting disease in the future, which is just absolutely incredible. I mean, we are going to move on to tips, because I know many of you will be thinking, okay, this is all great. I'm sort of hearing about all these things that sleep does, but how do I get more? So we're gonna come to that shortly. But so much I want to talk to you about, Matthew. I mean, I think we could easily make this like a full day podcast. I'm that fascinated in this.
I'd love to return at some point, should you wish me to.
Yeah, well, 100%. But I think, what you said about medical school training, I think it's very important, because pretty much everything that I put in here, and then the last quarter of the book is on sleep. I'm not convinced that any of that came from my medical school training. So that was all self-taught from, spending hours on PubMed, reading research, going to conferences, trying to learn more, because I wanted to help my patients more. And I thought, I need to know more about this so I can actually do my patients, and give them a better service. So you're saying that maybe medical students may get maybe 2 hours or so, and you'd love to sort of try and help that and get maybe a sleep curriculum into medical schools. And this really, I think one of the reasons we get on so well is there's so much synergy in our viewpoint in terms of how we think this needs to change. So what I've done over the past 6 months is develop a brand new course with a colleague of mine, Dr. Panjir, called Prescribing Lifestyle Medicine. And it's a one-day masterclass to teach healthcare professionals, but primarily doctors, on the basics of, lifestyle medicine, if you will, as a term. So we go into sleep and we teach this framework where they can simply apply these 4 pillars with their patients to start to actually implement lifestyle medicine. I'd love to maybe collaborate with you and show you the slides.
I'd love to. And I've got, I teach a whole course at the University of California, Berkeley, the science of sleep. So I've got lots of slides. I'd love to just share and do whatever I could to try and help sort of perpetuate that movement that you've got going. It's wonderful. That's exactly what we need.
Yeah, and then maybe we can talk about how we get that into medical schools, and
Yeah, I was going to actually ask you, how could we, even collectively, think about trying to, approach sort of medicine here in the United Kingdom and see if we could.
Well, we'll talk about that off air from the podcast, because I think that could be a great collaboration.
Fucking way.
Okay, Matthew, I know you're short on time, and again, we could just go on for so long. I was going to ask you about sleep and stress, but I think, guys, for those of you listening to this, I cover that in quite a bit of detail, I think, with you on my chat that's on my Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Dr. Chatterjee. So, guys, you can actually check it out there. But everything that Matthew and I talk about, including that Lancet paper that he mentioned, is going to be in the show notes, which is going to be at drchatterjee.com/why we sleep. There's going to be links there to everything Matthew talks about, some of Matthew's articles, his book, all kinds of things. So guys, do check that out after the podcast, and you can do a bit of further reading on those topics that interest you. Where to go to next? I mean, one thing that we do talk about on that course, and I think we've not spoken about this yet, is about sleep and its role in mental health. And, what's interesting, you mentioned bi-directional relationships before, and how a lack of sleep can increase our risk of problems, but also sleep can be a treatment as well for various things. And I wonder if you could talk about that in relation to mental health problems such as anxiety and depression, and maybe from then just move briefly onto Alzheimer's if possible.
Yeah. So we've done a lot of work in this area of sort of sleep and mental health. I think the first point to note is that we have not been able to discover a single psychiatric condition in which sleep is normal.
Wow.
And I think sleep has a profound story to tell in our understanding, in our treatment, maybe even ultimately at some point our prevention of grave mental illness. And I don't say that flippantly. Firstly, we've done some work where you can take healthy individuals and you can deprive them of sleep for a single night. And then you place them inside an MRI scanner and you look at how their brain has changed. And what we find is that these deep emotional brain centers erupt when you're sleep deprived. You become a lot more emotionally reactive, impulsive. There's a deep brain center called the amygdala, which is one of the centerpiece regions of the generation of strong emotions. That part of the brain is up to 60% more reactive when you're sleep deprived relative to when you've had a good, solid night of sleep. And we've also found
That's a huge amount.
It's a 60%. It's very difficult to usually see that type of a change in the brain without some kind of pathology or drug.
And I think
sleep deprivation will do it.
On an intuitive level, most people recognize that when they haven't slept well, they're just a little bit more reacted to things. That email from their boss, for example, can be easily misinterpreted. Are they annoyed at me? Are they, you suddenly start to see things that aren't there. And I've just, as I mentioned this before, I've just completed my second book called The Stress Solution, which is going to come out in January. And I cover a little bit of this that you're talking about in that to really try and show people that, lack of sleep is a stress on our body. And 60%, that's incredible.
Change in the brain, yeah. And I think it really comes, you're absolutely right. Many of us have a sense that, I just snapped ... Those are the words that usually follow a bad night of sleep or when you've not got enough sleep. And we know it all the way down sort of the age chain. You think about a parent holding a child, the child is crying and they look at you and they say, well, they just didn't sleep well last night. As if there's some universal knowledge that bad sleep the night before equals bad mood and emotion reactivity the next day. And it doesn't stop in infancy or childhood or adolescence. It's true when we are adults as well. And we've seen this data. What I think is concerning is that neurological signature that we discovered in that study is not dissimilar to numerous psychiatric conditions. And in fact, we're now finding significant links between sleep disruption and depression, anxiety, including PTSD, schizophrenia, and most recently and tragically, suicide as well. In fact, a short sleep duration is usually predictive of either suicidal ideation, suicidal thoughts, suicide attempts, and tragically, suicide completion. So I think the scope through which sleep is impacting mental health disease, I think, is considerable. We used to think in psychiatry that the psychiatric disease was perhaps causing the sleep disruption. I think now we've been forced to change our minds. It's not as though it's completely in the opposite direction. It's not that every psychiatric condition is a sleep disorder. That's not true either. But is it a two-way street? I think that's probably more tenable. In fact, is the dominant flow of traffic perhaps more in one direction than the other? I think that's also reasonable to assume on the basis of the data right now as well. So I think it's, there's clearly an intimate relationship between our mental health and our sleep health.
Matthew, these, the implications of what you just said, I think, are so profound. We've got to accept in the 21st century, not only do we not prioritize sleep enough, we're a chronically sleep-deprived society. We're now going through a mental health epidemic. Mind, the charity here in the UK, say that about 1 in 4 people in the UK now in any given year are going to be diagnosed with a mental health problem. Right, now that's incredible. And when you hear about that research, we think chronically sleep-deprived society, mental health problems on the rise. Yes, there are other factors. Okay, I don't think you
both of us agree on that. Yeah,
we're not trying to say it's all to do with sleep, but what we are trying to say is that sleep is a critical part of the equation and one that we can no longer afford to ignore. So I find that research fascinating, and it makes me think as a doctor. You've mentioned already type 2 diabetes, heart disease, mental health problems such as depression and anxiety. I know. At our previous discussion, again, guys, I'd point you to that Facebook discussion because we won't have time to go into this today, but we will when I get you back on the podcast. On our Facebook discussion, we did go into Alzheimer's and how, sleep deprivation you feel may be causative now or one of the causative factors that causes Alzheimer's disease.
That's right.
I'm thinking, well, I often say this when I'm teaching doctors, why are we not bringing up sleep quality with pretty much every single patient that walks in through our door?
And you could imagine the cost savings to, our economy. In fact, the Rand Corporation recently did a survey, the enormous cost of sleep deprivation throughout a number of developed nations. What they found was that a lack of sleep costs most nations about 2% of their GDP. So here in the United Kingdom, that's £30 billion of lost economic value caused by insufficient sleep. In the United States, it was $411 billion. In Japan, it was $138 billion. In other words, if you solve the sleep loss epidemic, imagine you could almost double the budget for education, or you could perhaps even halve the healthcare deficit. Theresa May just this week, as we're speaking here, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, described a £20 billion injection of funds into the national healthcare system. And there's uproar about where that money is going to come from.
Sure.
Well, if we just simply prioritized and solved the sleep epidemic, the sleep loss epidemic, we could cover that and still have £10 billion left over.
Yeah, I know, and this podcast doesn't sound to be too political, but I would say that I find a lot of the messaging around the NHS in public very short-sighted. It's about pumping more money in to fix downstream issues, whereas we've got to look at prioritizing sleep as a society, whether it's the lighting that's used in hospitals when patients are trying to recover from illness, which isn't very helpful a lot of the time, whether it's teaching our children about it and encouraging good habits, at school, but also as parents with our kids, really ingraining. And I think, we've not really got into technology today and how the overuse of technology can potentially be problematic for sleep. I agree, sleep, it's such a simple lever to turn. It's also, we'll come into tips in just a second, but so many health inequalities are there from people from different socioeconomic groups. We know in the UK that, you can have as much of a 10-year difference in your life expectancy depending on where you live. Well, one thing I like about a focus on sleep, and I appreciate that there are many pressures in deprived communities, financial stresses, maybe a lot of shift work, maybe working multiple jobs.
That's
so
right.
I absolutely understand and recognise that there are significant issues that we have to overcome. But a lot of the recommendations that we're now going to talk about, that I cover in my book and you cover in detail in your book, most of the recommendations to help people to, get more quality sleep are free of charge.
Yeah, I often say that I think sleep is perhaps the most democratically freely available healthcare system for everyone around the world. Now, that's a bit of a glib statement on the basis of exactly what you just said, I think about, and the data is quite frightening. We've been looking at this too, at sort of low socioeconomic status communities, and there what you'd see is just what you described, higher general social stress that impairs sleep, usually working multiple different jobs, split shifts, working the night work. Often people in those communities are working in the service industry. That usually means that you're either up very early or you're staying in work very late, all of which comprise, factors that work against sleep. So I want to be really appreciative of that.
Me too.
But still, I think, the tips that we can do right now to start sleeping better every night should be applicable and for the most part utilized by just about everyone, as long as you don't have a sleep disorder.
Well, Matthew, normally I end the podcast off by asking people for 4 key tips that people can put into practice immediately, but we don't have to limit it to 4. I want this podcast to inspire people to not only take sleep seriously, but to give them some practical help. So immediately after listening to this, I can put the headphones down and go, right, I'm going to do what Professor Walker's asked me to do. I'm going to try, these 5 things today. In your experience, and you've been interviewed all around the world now to do with your book, what are those common things that people aren't doing that they could do to help improve their sleep?
Yeah, so there's probably maybe 5 things that people can do right now to get better sleep. The first is regularity. Going to bed at the same time and waking up at the same time, no matter what. Even if you've had a bad night of sleep, still try to wake up at the same time. Just understand it's going to be a tough next day. And then get to bed at the same time that following night, and you'll have a good night of sleep. You'll sort of sleep a little bit more soundly that night. Even if it's the weekday or the weekend, don't do what we call social jet lag, which is sort of where you sort of sleep too late at the weekend, and then on Sunday night you've got to drag your body clock all the way back and try and force it to sleep at a time when you haven't been sleeping before. That's torture. Regularity is key. The second thing is temperature. We've spoken a little bit about that, but keep your bedroom cool. Probably around about 18 degrees Celsius, which is colder than most people think. But cooling the room down takes your body into that right sort of thermal space for good sleep. It cools it down. Darkness, we've spoken about too, but we are, I think, a dark-deprived society in this modern era. And you need darkness at night to allow the release of a hormone called melatonin, which helps time the healthy onset of your sleep. So, yes, it's to do with blue light sort of emitting devices, screens, phones. Those are things that you should try and stay away from in the last hour before bed. But it's not just that. It's also overhead lighting. We don't need to be bathed in electric light all night. In the last hour before bed, just try turning half of the lights off in your flat or in your home. You'd be surprised at how soporific and sleepy you become when you're shrouded in darkness. So that's the third thing. The fourth thing is, I would say, walk it out. And what I mean by that is, don't stay in bed if you've been awake for 20 or 25 minutes, either trying to fall asleep or you've woken up and you're trying to get back to sleep. The reason is because your brain is this wonderfully associative device, and it will start to very quickly learn that being in bed is about being awake rather than asleep. So what you need to do is, after about 25 minutes, just relax, understand that sleep is not quite here yet, go to a different room, in dim light, read a book or listen to a podcast, but don't check email, don't eat because it trains your brain to expect that in the middle of the night. Only return to bed when you are very sleepy, And that way your brain will start to relearn the association that your bedroom is the place of sleep rather than the place of
I think
wake.
that's a really important tip, Matthew, that, I know even from our first conversation on Facebook, but, whenever I talk about sleep, people can often get really wound up about this and say, I'm doing all those things, I can't sleep. And they've really just, without trying to, their brain has just got into this position where it's been trained not to sleep. It's been trained to not associate the bedroom with sleep. Or, so many people I see, when I hear about on social media are doing work emails right up to the moment they fall asleep. And we mentioned children before, and I often say, children need a bedtime routine. We know that. Right? Why as adults do we think we're any different?
We should, and you're absolutely right. We've turned the bed in this day and age often, into a kitchen, we've turned it into an office, we've turned it into a cinema. We do all of these things typically on the bed, which then it does impact the brain's association. It gets quite confused about what this thing called the bed is all about. So I think that's a very helpful tip. And try not to get too anxious if you're sort of falling asleep. I know that probably a lot of what I've been telling people will make you feel anxious if you're not being able to get the sleep that you need. But try not to worry about it. Everyone has a bad night of sleep. Just get up, understand that you're going to be awake for a little bit longer, and then go back to bed, and you will start to relearn that association. And in fact, a lot of people and patients will say to me, well, I've been falling asleep on the settee watching television, and then I get into bed and I'm wide awake and I don't know why. And again, it's because of this association that you've learned with the bed. The final two things, one of which we've mentioned, is what you intake into your body, caffeine and alcohol. We've spoken about caffeine, but I'll speak about alcohol quickly. Many people use alcohol as a sleep aid, and it is anything but an assistant to sleep. Alcohol is a class of drugs that we call the sedatives, and sedation is not sleep. Unfortunately,
sedation is not sleep.
It's very different. So what you're doing when you have a nightcap or you use alcohol to try and get to sleep, and many people do, understandably so, they mistake one for the other. You're just knocking your cortex out. You're not in natural sleep. The two other problems with alcohol and sleep: firstly, alcohol will fragment your sleep. So if I were to record someone's sleep in the laboratory after they've had a couple of drinks, their sleep is littered with all of these awakenings throughout the night. Now, you tend not to remember waking up, but the next day you feel, again, unrefreshed. You don't feel sort of bright and alert or restored by your sleep. But you don't remember waking up, so you don't link it to the alcohol. But alcohol is bad at fragmenting your sleep, produces poor quality. The final thing alcohol is good at doing is blocking your dream sleep or your REM sleep. And we know, to come back to our conversation, REM sleep is critical for emotional first aid. REM sleep provides overnight therapy. It's a form of emotional convalescence, and alcohol will block that REM sleep quite viciously. So those would be the 5 tips, I think, for better sleep.
Yeah, Matthew, thanks. I love that. Just to say on alcohol, is it dose dependent? So, for example, some people say, well, I'm okay with 1 glass of wine, but 2 or 3 glasses is going to fragment my sleep. Can you comment on the dosage there, or would you advise people who are struggling with sleep to knock it on its head, basically?
I know, and it's so hard for me to answer this, and this is the reason, one of the many reasons why I'm such a deeply unpopular person. But
I don't think that's fair to say. But
firstly, I don't want to sound puritanical. Life is to be lived to a degree, and all of these things that we're discussing, we're trying to speak about the extremes. But I also want to empower people with the knowledge. I'm not here to tell you necessarily what you should or you shouldn't do. I just want to give you the scientific facts, and then you can make the choice. I would say, unfortunately, that even just 1 glass of alcohol in the evening, we can see that, we can measure that.
You can measure that in your lab. You can see that you're not getting the same deep level of restorative sleep, even with 1 drink.
Even with 1 drink. So I know it's hard, but now, everyone, should, have a social life and sort of, enjoy a drink now and again. I think the best advice would be this: if you're going to bed feeling tipsy, you probably have had too much alcohol in terms of sleep impairment.
I think, I so resonate with so much of what you've just said, which is, this podcast, what I do, what you do, it's not about telling people what to do. I've got no interest of telling someone what they should do. I have no right to tell someone what they should do with their lives. what I think we're trying to do is to educate people, inspire them, empower them to understand what lifestyle choices they're making and how that could impact their health. And I always draw the analogy with going out, having a few drinks with your mates on a Friday night. People know intuitively that if I go out for a drink on a Friday night and have 3 or 4 pints, let's say, you know what, my Saturday morning might be a bit of a write-off. I may not be functioning as well as I might want to. But you're going into that with that knowledge. You're saying, you know, I know the effect alcohol has on me, but I'm going to get so much enjoyment out of my night out tonight that I'm willing to put up with the consequences. What I think we're both trying to say is, guys, we just want to empower you. We want to help you understand the impact that caffeine might be having on your sleep, that alcohol might be having on your sleep, that the fact that you're on your work emails before you go to bed might be having on your sleep. Do with that information what you will, you know. That's how I would put it.
I so agree, because I think, you know, a lot of, you know, what you speak about in your book, which is, you know, far more wide ranging than mine, because I just take one of the things, you go after 4 of the key key pillars, which is so much more impressive. I think it says so much about the difference between me and you, Rangan. But
you're a researcher. I'm a clinician, right? There's a big difference, right?
There is, but I still think it's a heroic thing. But what I would say, I think, is that yes, a lot of people are aware of some of these things, you know, like it's good to be physically active, you know, I should try and stay away from drinking too much alcohol. But I also think that there's a lot of what we discuss, you know, I hope in both books, that is perhaps knowledge that people aren't aware of.
Yeah.
And if only that they were aware of it, they would actually want to do something different. That's the sort of the case that I'm really passionate about, is that people, as long as you know the information and you choose to do otherwise, no problem at all. A lot of people just are either misinformed or entirely, when it comes to sleep, uninformed. That's the goal.
That is the goal, and it's really about, it's that empowerment piece. And this is one thing I just want to end on, is just to say, guys, look, it may not be that you can just change one thing and suddenly have a great night's sleep. You might have to change 3 or 4 things together. You know, that's certainly my experience. It's like, you know, Matthew, you know, you're a researcher, so a lot, you know, you'll do research and showing what caffeine does, on showing what alcohol does. But I would say, as a clinician, use that research, but maybe you might have to try a few things. Like you might try, for example, 1 week with no caffeine and no alcohol and see how you sleep, because then you can be empowered to decide what you're going to do after that. Are you going to go back? Or maybe then, I always try and get people sleeping as well as they've ever slept. Then they can start reintroducing some of these lifestyle things that they want, and they can say, oh, wow, that's interesting. I felt great last week, but now when I have a 2 p.m. coffee, you know what, I'm not quite as good. Okay, that's going to teach me now that I'm gonna knock it a bit earlier in the day, because I think ultimately nobody's going to follow your advice or my advice simply because we told them to. I think it's only when they start to feel the difference themselves, they go, wow, you know, I kind of like feeling good.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I love your point about just trying to give it time too. You know, sleep and starting to change your sleep and seeing the effects of getting better sleep. It's a little bit like exercise at the gym. You know, you're not going to go to the gym one day and wake up looking like Arnold Schwarzenegger. You know, it just takes some time, but if you commit to it, you will see gradual change. And it's the same thing with sleep as well. But I also think, I love the idea of you know, putting sleep in that bedrock place and then starting to introduce the other factors. What's lovely is that many of them will actually fall in place when sleep is stabilized. And I'll give you a good example of diet. We know that without sufficient sleep, 2 critical appetite hormones go in opposite bad directions. One of those hormones is called leptin, which is a hormone that sort of signals to your body you're full, you don't want to eat anymore. The other hormone is called ghrelin, which does the opposite. It says you're not satisfied with your food, you want to eat more. And despite leptin and ghrelin sounding like 2 hobbits, they are actually real hormones. What's interesting is that when you sleep deprive people, or even just limit them to maybe just like 5 or 6 hours of sleep for a week, levels of leptin, which say you're full, don't eat more, they drop down. Levels of ghrelin that ramp up your hunger and say, I've just eaten a big meal, but I'm not satisfied, I want to eat more. That hormone skyrockets when you're underslept. So no wonder people who are sleeping just 5 to 6 hours a night will actually eat on average somewhere between 200 to 300 extra calories every single day.
Yeah,
so you can solve sleep, and you will actually start to not want to eat as much.
Yeah, and this is why a part of weight loss is to sleep better. It's a critical factor, and I think next time I get you on, Matthew, we'll probably go into detail on that. We'll probably go into detail on Alzheimer's and maybe even things like menopausal symptoms and hormonal symptoms that I also see sleep deprivation playing a huge role in. I know you're on a really busy schedule. That's what happens when you have such a popular international best-selling book.
Well, and you know all about that too. So.
Well, guys, I'd highly encourage you to pick up Matthew's book, Why We Sleep. It's absolutely brilliant. It's got pretty much everything you've ever wanted to know about sleep. I think you'll probably find in that book. I look forward to when you release a later edition, when you've got newer research coming out in the future at some points. But Matthew, one question I like to ask my guests who are, leading researchers in the field is, as you became more and more aware of all this sleep research, what was the biggest thing in your own lifestyle that you changed on the back of your research?
I think it was probably caffeine. I think just seeing the data and then doing those types of studies ourselves, and particularly the finding that we discussed where even if you're asleep, the quality of that sleep is just not as deep. That really got me concerned, and that's when I really started to pay attention to my caffeine content.
And are you teetotal now with caffeine, or are you?
So right now, yeah, I am. I drink decaffeinated tea and I drink decaffeinated coffee. I sometimes, I've ebbed and flowed between sort of having coffee in the morning because I do feel it's alerting benefits, but we didn't necessarily evolve to be medicated with caffeine. And I think anyone who's, drinking caffeine at 11 a.m., which on the basis of your circadian rhythm, if you listen to the wonderful podcast with Sachin Panda that you did, your peak of your circadian rhythm is right around sort of the 11 o'clock period. That's when it should be almost impossible for you to fall asleep. But yet, I sometimes look around on an airplane when I'm leaving and half the plane is asleep at 11 o'clock.
Yeah.
And if you're self-medicating your sleep deprivation at 11 a.m. with caffeine, it usually means that you're perhaps just not getting enough sleep. And that's probably been one of the greatest, I think, influential factors. That and the impact on my productivity, I think that was the most underrated. And it actually forced me to start doing a lot of research on sleep loss and productivity that maybe on a second podcast we can talk about.
Get into, yeah.
But, my ability to maintain focus and produce high quality output work is dramatically dependent on the sleep that I've been having at night.
That absolutely echoes what Professor Panda said a few weeks ago on this podcast. When he goes off caffeine, his productivity goes up. So guys, look, no one's asking you guys to cut out caffeine. I know how much you guys love it. I have certainly had my own love-hate relationship, more love of a relationship with coffee in the past, but I have dramatically reduced it and I'm feeling better than I've ever felt. Matthew, I really want to thank you for the time you've made today to come onto the show to really talk to my listeners who really are big fans of your work, really are looking for those actionable bits of information that they can take into their life. So I want to thank you for that. I absolutely will take you up on your promise. I'm going to call it a promise to come back on the podcast.
It is a promise.
Guys, look, that is the end of my conversation with Professor Matthew Walker. Don't forget, you can see all the show notes at drchatterjee.com/why we sleep. Everything we're talking about, a lot more articles from Matthew. I'm going to put them all there so you can continue your learning experience. Guys, I'd love you to take a screenshot of the podcast, share it on social media. We want to get this information on sleep to as many people as possible, and you can help us do that by promoting and sharing this podcast on social media. If you could tag me, but you could also tag Matthew. Matthew, what social media network do you tend to be on?
Yeah, so I'm on the internet all over the place at Sleep Diplomat. So at Sleep Diplomat on Twitter. And you can find me on the web at sleepdiplomat.com. And I would love to learn more about what people enjoyed and just hear their thoughts about sleep on Twitter. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, guys, so please do tag me, tag Matthew. I'm going to put all those social media links on the show notes. So do check them out, as well as sharing this with your friends. If you could go onto whichever podcast platform you are listening to this on and give the podcast a 5-star review. What it does is it helps raise the profile of the podcast. It helps get the podcast to more people, but it also helps me attract fantastic guests, such as Professor Walker, so I can get you.
Today's guest is Dr. Matthew Walker, author of New York Times bestselling book, Why We Sleep, Unlocking the Power of Sleep and Dreams, professor of neuroscience and psychology at the University of California, Berkeley, and director of the Center for Human Sleep Science.
Jesus fuck. Hvor er den henne? Der.
If I could forget just what we had, spend all of my days outside my head, without all these feelings we've been fed, forget everything that I once said, could you move on? I don't want you gone.
Så var han i gang med at indfange. Det var da irriterende. Okay. Det er jo ikke noget af det der.
That's still recharging. I can't cast that yet. That's still recharging. It's too far away. That spell isn't ready.
Og så bare en, giv mig en. Nej.
How are you? See you soon. Hey there. Have a good one.
Come on.
You wanna turn me off. You wanna flip the switch.
Okay.
I wanna break the lock. I know what makes you tick. We used to be so young and free. Yeah, baby, don't treat me like a machine. I could still be just what you need. No, baby, don't treat me like a machine. Wanna go to your apartment, take it back to where we started. We'll be everything you
Rainbow.
you want it, you want it. And I know it could be perfect. I know it will be worth it. We'll be everything you wanted.
Help you find something? Go with me.
What's on your mind?
I can feel the pistol forming in my chest. I'm about to say some things that I regret. I've talked myself in circles all night long and sleep through the morning. Is it my fault? Is it my fault? Is it my fault? I can't keep these thoughts at rest. Is it my fault? If I can't calm myself down, they won't let me take a breath.
Ready. I can't
That is sick. Absolutely insane gamer. Det håber jeg. Jeg vil gerne løbe Thijs. That's sick. Det er saver.
You will know this episode starts sort of abruptly. The opening discussion is about how sleep patterns change during human development, especially around age 12 months when motor skill learning increases. Matt and I had planned on doing an intro, but the camera was rolling and the discussion was so interesting that we just kept going. This one is a good one, folks. Enjoy.
What's really interesting is that if you look at sort of sleep, and we've done some of this work, and maybe we'll speak about it on sleep and motor skill learning, and that seems to be more dependent on this sort of lighter form of non-REM sleep, stage 2, and particularly the burst of electrical activity, the sleep spindles. There's a really bizarre bump in stage 2 and sleep spindles during development. It happens right around the 12-month period. which is where all of a sudden you start to see considerable limb or multi-limb coordination. In other words, you start to perambulate, you start to learn how to walk. It's almost as though there's like a homeostatic response, which is that with the drive for motor plasticity and learning comes a response from sleep to say, oh, now we're into motor skill learning, we need to consolidate. And you get this, it's a really strange bump and it dies away again after
What's the spindle, sleep to spindle? What is it? What stage is that?
Well, you see sleep spindles throughout almost all of non-REM. So once you get past the lightest sort of stage 1 non-REM, then you get spindles throughout all of non-REM. But they are a prototypical feature of stage 2 non-REM as well. But then stage 3 and 4, which is sort of like the deep sleep stuff, you also get spindles there too. But in our hands, at least, the strongest sleep stage and the strongest electrical signature in your EEG that is predictive of your motor skill learning is stage 2 and sleep spindles, both of which seem to have this bizarre sort of, coincidental spike right around this developmental phase of crawling, standing, walking.
So many things going on during the development. It's so fascinating to observe, for sure.
And language too. I mean, when we've looked at this as well with teaching adults foreign languages, or even actually just mathematical languages or artificial grammar, sleep is a huge component in that. But they also saw this fascinating thing with development.
Nej, det mener du ikke.
Concrete learning
Du
of
kan dør.
individual facts, but the generalization of knowledge. So this is sort of the thing that I think separates us from computers, at least for now, which is that computers are very good at storing individual bytes of information in a veridical way, very clearly, and we can do that too, storing individual facts. But what computers don't do, which is what we do, is intelligently associate them together. So
oh my god, jeg vidste, det var en dårlig idé. Fuck, nej.
And statistical rules about this thing called the world in which we live. And yeah, sorry, I was just going to say that you can, with infants, you can teach them just these novel sounds, and each one of these strings of sounds is unique and different. But there's something common about the grammar that is binding and overarching across all of them. There is an overarching schema that you could learn in addition to each one of the individual facts. After they've had a nap versus an infant that has not had
det var nok det for mig. Jeg gider nok ikke igen.
Post-nap,
Jeg vil ikke blive forløbet.
have extracted and understood the generalized rules of what they've been learning, not just the individual facts. Whereas infants that have learned but haven't napped have not sort of made the abstraction.
So being a nap Nazi, I should be rewarded for that, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean,
like...
it stays from infancy all the way through to adulthood. So if you're napping, I'm not gonna. Well, there's a few double-edged sword aspects.
Men du, det er sådan lidt, fordi de skal jo begge to være online på samme tidspunkt, så det er sådan lidt, det kan man ikke rigtig lave på samme måde. Okay, fucking lort. Mand, hvor var det nederen? Hvor fuck kom de alle fra?
We're talking about basically being able to connect the dots, so it's how that sort of differentiates us from what a computer can do. I mean, one of the things. But is there a certain? I remember reading in your book, and this is probably the part of the book that I was more skimming, and that was the importance of REM sleep and dreaming and creativity. So is that connecting? Because I feel like connecting the dots is requires some creative thought to be able to kind of like put things together and come up with the big picture idea and figure things out. So is it known? Is REM sleep important for that?
Yeah, it does seem to be. So if there is, I mean, we could take a step back and think about how does sleep achieve memory processing, learning, information processing. And sleep seems to be important in at least 3 ways. First, you need sleep before learning to actually get your brain ready to initially soak up new information, to initially lay down new memory traces. But you also then need sleep after learning to take those freshly minted memories in the brain, particularly in a region that we call the hippocampus, which you could think of almost like the informational inbox of your brain, that it's very good at receiving those sort of new memory files. But you need sleep after learning to take those new memories and then essentially hit the save button on them so that you don't forget those informational pieces of the puzzle. So sleep before learning to get your brain ready to acquire information, sleep after learning to hold on to those individual facts.
So let me get this straight. So if you want, for example, short-term memory, right? Because if you're sort of wanting to store things in the hippocampus, even short-term, that would be sleep before.
That's right.
And then if you want to then consolidate it and have a long-term memory, that would be your sleep after?
That's sleep after. Okay. So you can't cheat sleep on either side of the memory equation. You can't pull the all-nighter and hope to be able to continue to learn. And we did this study. We said sort of, is it wise to pull the all-nighter before the exam? So we took a group of individuals, assigned them to one of 2 groups, a sleep group and a sleep deprivation group. Sleep group, they get a full 8 hours of sleep that we measured here at the sleep center. The deprivation group, we keep awake all night under full supervision, and they don't get any naps. There's no caffeine. It's miserable for everyone involved, and no caffeine at all. And then the next day, we placed them inside an MRI scanner, and we had them try and learn and cram, essentially, a whole list of new facts into the brain, into the hippocampus. And the first result was that the sleep deprivation group was about 40% more deficient in their learning ability. So they learned 40% less, 40. Which is
astronomical. That's a huge...
Non-trivial.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to put that in context, I guess it's the difference between acing an exam and failing it miserably, 40%. Totally. What was interesting, though, was what was going on in the hippocampus, this informational inbox of the brain. When we looked at that in those people who'd had a full night of sleep, you saw lots of healthy learning-related activity. It was beautiful. In the sleep deprivation group, we actually couldn't find any significant signal whatsoever. And so it was almost as though sleep deprivation had sort of shut down your memory inbox, and any new incoming files were being bounced. And we put forward a theory as to why that was. That the hippocampus, being a short-term reservoir of memory, has a limited storage capacity.
Yeah.
Perhaps a little bit like a USB stick. And you have maybe in humans a 16-hour recording capacity for information acquisition before you have to sleep. Because it's during sleep then after learning. So that's sort of the story before learning. It's not great. We can show it. We know in the brain what part of the brain is failing to produce those impairments.
In that study, you were testing the ability to acquire new information.
Exactly, to sort of lay down those fresh memories and just to grab hold of them. And you can't do that well without sufficient sleep. And that seems to be in part related to your non-rapid eye movement sleep or your non-REM sleep. But then what we've also done in lots of studies, and we and lots of other people have now replicated this finding, sleep after learning then takes those memories and I said sort of hits the save button on them. It's a little bit crass. Actually, what really happens is that during sleep, there is a file transfer mechanism that takes place at night, that we shift memories from that short-term vulnerable storage reservoir, the hippocampus, and we move them out to the long-term storage site within the brain, which is the cortex, which essentially acts like a hard drive. And that means that when you wake up the next day, there are 2 delightful benefits. First, having shifted those memories from the short-term vulnerable reservoir to that more permanent, sort of safe storage haven in the brain, they're protected and they're safe, so that you're going to remember rather than forget. The second benefit, however, is that sort of having cleared off those files from the hippocampus, almost like shifting files from the USB stick, you've cleared out all of that fresh memory encoding reservoir so that when you wake up the next morning, you can start acquiring new files all over again. So it's this sort of elegant symbiotic system of memory that happens.
Yeah, beautiful.
And yeah, absolutely. Sorry.
Well, we'll of course use all this.
It's hermetically sealed. It's bizarre.
I remember reading somewhere that when you sleep, and this is related to what you were just talking about, that your brain sort of replays, like electrical activity-wise, it looks like you're literally like reliving the same thing you just learned or something. Is that
absolutely correct? So these studies firstly happened in animals, and we've now been replicating some of them with brain imaging, with MRI scans in humans. Hard to believe, but we can do it. Fascinating. They would place electrodes into that structure that we spoke about, the hippocampus. Also rats as well. And it helps rats learn spatial navigation. And they would place lots of electrodes into this part of the brain. And as the rat would run around the maze and learn the maze, individual cells would fire, and they would spatially code which part of the maze the rat was in. So different cells are mapping different parts. It's like sort of navigating a route from your home to work. Different sort of cells are coding the journey along the way.
Yeah, I probably would suck at doing that, but.
And I lost that. Yeah, some people say it's a male aspect of the gene, but I definitely lost it anyway. But what was delightful was that you could sort of sound tone on each one of these electrodes. And what you would hear, and this is, for audio, you would hear the as the rat was running around the maze, as these cells were learning and coding, creating this kind of memory circuit. And yeah, it's off it goes. But what was genius is that they were recording, and as the rat fell asleep, what did they hear? And it wasn't just static random firing, which is what we thought typically happened. In that static of electrical impulses at night and this sea of electrical noise came out a very clear predictive method, which was so it was exactly the same temporal sequence, bum, 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 but it was sped up. And we now know that it's during sleep that we replay, but we replay at somewhere between 10 to 20 times the speed. So it's as though you're kind of, you've done the, recording of whatever happened during the day, but then it gets replayed, but at times 20 or times 10.
Wow. So is this a long-term potentiation part? Is this where it's solidifying? Now, what stage of sleep is that?
So that's during non-REM sleep. Yep, that we see.
So it's the sleep I'm always trying to optimize for.
And it's difficult, I think, sleep in general is difficult for so many people, and we can see why, but so this starts to come back to your original question about REM sleep, though. So we get this memory replay, absolutely fascinating. We now see it, we can even manipulate it, which is amazing. So if I teach you some information on, let's say it's about a fire engine, and learn both objects, a resolution of that on a screen. And then tomorrow, we're going to sort of come back, and I'm just going to show you the image and say, do you remember seeing it or not? Yes or no? And if you do remember seeing it, you've got to place where you thought it was on the screen. You have to learn the item, and you have to learn the location. Here's the great part. During the initial learning session, not only do you see fire engine, but we play the sound of the fire engine ring, and then we show you a whistle, meowing, with a sound, and it's a congruent sound, fire engine sound, fire engine. I can teach you 100 of these items, and then during sleep, I just use those sounds that you heard, as if I'm trying to get into your brain and I'm selectively reactivating those individual memories. But I'm only going to reactivate and replay half of those memories. I'm only going to replay 50 of the 100 things that you've learned. And then the next day, we wake you up and we test you. And firstly, memory is better after sleep. That's what we found. What's interesting, those items that I replayed during sleep, they are almost twice as superior in terms of your memory retention.
So the playing of them doesn't disrupt the sleep at all? Or?
Well, that's the key. You have to play at a sub-threshold awakening sound. So we will keep your auditory threshold, and we will then play the sound at a level that we know is below your awakening threshold. So it's still just enough to get in, to penetrate into the brain and tickle the memory and reactivate it. But it's not enough to wake you up. So now, you could imagine, I've got these science fiction ideas thinking, well, I learn all of this information, and maybe I can just put my favorite playlist on, at nice low sound, and like these memories, or maybe a study aid where you help students learn.
Do you think coupling different sounds maybe with learning facts may actually help?
Yeah.
Like irrespective of replaying them during sleep, do you think just even the coupling of the sounds somehow can help?
As long as those sounds have been coupled and bound to specific information, and this is what we call context-dependent or cue-dependent memory. This is well known in psychology over about 100 years. If you study in the room that you're going to take the exam, you do better because you actually use cues, textual cues from around the room that are triggers to help you better remember.
Wow. So
we're just doing that with sleep.
What about caffeine? So if you study caffeinated and you don't take your exam caffeinated, is this kind of the same concept?
We don't know that. It's an interesting thing. Caffeine may be a non-stimulant. Whether it works with ingested substances. We know, however, this works also with odors. So have you ever had that experience where you're sitting in an airport and you're sort of tying your shoelaces after security, someone walks past with that cologne or a perfume of a person you knew, and it instantly unlocks that memory, as if the sound has triggered the reactivation of the memory and it comes flooding back. Well, you can do the same thing with this memory sleep trick, where I teach you stuff during the day and we can puff certain odors up your nose and associate the smell with the learning material, and then during sleep, you refuse the odor up the nose, and you can get the same benefit as well, the same doubling of benefit.
That's fascinating. I remember the study that was done that was coupling an odor, it was like a cherry blossom odor, with classical fear studies that they do in mice, it was in rodents. And the odor or the cherry blossom was inducing, that was like changing some receptor on the glucocorticoid receptor. So it was getting passed on to like the next generation. And so even though the next generation didn't have the shock of the smell, if they were exposed to the smell, they had a fear.
Memory was translated from one generation to the next.
Anyways, it'd be fascinating to know what role sleep plays in the epigenetic transfer.
Right, so if we all start doing this, are our children going to be incredible memory replayers, by the way? But to come back to you, I'm sorry I've taken a desperately long time to answer your original question, which was, what about REM sleep? So what we've spoken about is the first two of the three stages of memory processing with sleep. Sleep before to get the brain ready to lay down memories, sleep after to grab a hold of those individual memories and cement them into the neural architecture of the brain. Once you've done that, though, there's a final step, and that seems to be not complete, but instead
Vas-y, les mecs qui s'allongent, ils savent pas.
Wow, jeg går det lige nu, man. Holy shit.
Describe it as a little bit like group therapy for memories, that sleep has gathered in all of the information during the day, and during non-REM sleep, which always comes first, by the way. In our sleep cycle, we always have non-REM sleep first, then REM sleep second, then non-REM sleep again, then REM sleep second. And we don't know why. There is no good explanatory data suggesting why non-REM sleep always comes first and REM sleep second. But I've put forward the theory that for information processing, it makes sense, which is that non-REM sleep first, just get what you've learned, lock it into the brain. REM sleep then comes along. REM sleep starts to fuse all of the information you recently learned with the entire back catalogue of information that you've got stored up across a lifetime of experience. And
Vas-y, moi, les gars,
this
après,
sort
j'arrive.
of, essentially REM sleep is creating a revised mind-wide web of associations. And I'd like to sort of think of what's going on with REM sleep. We need a lot of these studies to look at this, and there's some special ways that we can look at this process, building new novel techniques. And it's almost like memory pinball, where you take these new memories and you sort of launch them up and you start bouncing them around into the architecture of information within the brain. And you're starting to test associations. You're starting to say, you know, could this new information be connected to this? Maybe not. Connected to this? Maybe not. Now, some of that happens whilst we're awake during the day.
Au moins, celui qui spawn, il en réa un autre, et le dernier réa le dernier.
Is that we make connections during REM sleep, but they're not of the same kind. The connections that we're making during REM sleep are the long shot. This is the bizarre,
right.
strange. You know, it's sort of, it would be the equivalent of saying during the day, we take this information and the connections we make are like a Google search gone right, which is the first page is all of the things that are most related. And it's very obvious, page 1, that's directly related to what I input. During REM sleep, it's almost as though you input the search term and you're immediately taken to page 20 of the Google search, which is about some field hockey game in Utah. And you think, I don't understand. Oh, that's interesting. I see what you're talking about. So we make these bizarre leaps of associative memory processing during REM sleep. And that's why we now understand that it's REM sleep that helps us divine remarkable creative insights into previously impenetrable problems. And this is, you can see this throughout the history of human beings, this dream-inspired insight, scientific demonstrations. You know, August Kekulé divined the idea of a benzene ring, these double carbon rings, by dreaming of a serpent that swallowed its tail. Dmitry Mendeleev, you know, came up with the periodic table of elements by way of dream inspiration. And you know, people have won Nobel Prizes. Otto Lowy won the Nobel Prize for the demonstration of chemical transmission across nerve cells. And he dreamt of the experiment that helped him prove that. He didn't dream of the concept itself, but he dreamt of the experiment to prove it. Wonderful artistic demonstrations of this too. You know, Paul McCartney has written innumerable songs, it turns out, by way of his dreams. Keith Richards came up with the opening chords of Satisfaction by way of dream-inspired insight. So REM sleep takes that third component of information processing, and I think it's what defines us differentially from computers in part, which is that deep sleep is about knowledge, which is gathering all of the information and holding onto it. REM sleep, I would argue, is about wisdom, which is knowing what it all means when you fit it together. You know, that's what I want from a good student. Don't just give me dry book learning. You really understand it. You apply it. You're creative. That's dream sleep.
Right. Why do you sometimes not remember your dreams and sometimes you do remember your dreams? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, so some of it seems to be about if you wake up out of that dream and then you go back to awakening, can sometimes help you commit that experience to memory. But there are people who say that I never remember my dreams. You know, we can bring those people into my sleep center and we can, you know, wake them up in the middle of dream sleep and they'll say it's remarkable for the first time I was dreaming. And the answer is no, it's not the first time that you were dreaming, it's just the first time that you've actually remembered a dream because it's the first time you've typically woken up.
Okay. My mother-in-law, you know, claims that she doesn't dream. Of course not.
Yeah, there are a selection of patients that have a lesion in a part of the prefrontal cortex in their white matter. You get a lesion deep down there, we do seem to genuinely see a cessation of dreams. By the way, I didn't even feel confident to write this in the book, and it's still a theory that I've never really aired in public, but go with me on this. Which is, I think that tenable theory. The problem is we don't have access to those dreams. Those dreams are memorized and they are available, they're just not accessible. I think what happens as we wake up is that we lose the IP address to those memories. And the reason I believe this to be potentially true is, have you ever had the experience?
Non, non, sur moi les gars, sur moi.
I was dreaming, and I didn't know I was dreaming.
Je le savais, je l'entendais.
Try as hard as you can, the harder you try, the worse the memory recall goes. And then you think, oh, forget it. 2 days later, you're walking along and you see a street sign, and all of a sudden it triggers the unlocking of that dream memory.
Ça veut dire quoi ça?
The dream was bad.
Break les gars, point vert.
That tells me that the memory was present, the memory was available. The problem was accessibility. You couldn't gain recall access. So the information was accessible.
It's happened to me just even after I've, when I go to bed, then, later that night, I hit
si j'ai
pillow and all of a
compris,
sudden I remember the dream.
les capteurs cardiaques, ça marche pas, on
That's
est
happened to me
d'accord.
more than once.
It tells you that there is. It's almost a scary prospect, which is that maybe every single one of our dreams about life
Il est vrai. Il descend.
and are present and determine our behavior. Because we know that there is an enormous amount of information that changes our behavior and our decisions, that goes on below the radar of consciousness, implicit memory. That could be true for dreaming. I've got an experiment that may be able to design to actually get at this. And if that's true, it should hopefully radically change our view of dreaming, that dreams are ephemeral, that they dissolve quickly, they're forgotten.
On peut pas prendre un drone?
Influence us as humans.
That would be pretty groundbreaking.
Yeah,
You just had a study I just read, I think yesterday on sleep and it affecting behavior, loneliness.
Yeah. So we just published a study demonstrating that sleep loss will trigger viral loneliness.
À ma gauche ici.
And it was a 3-part study. Firstly, the reason that I got into this was loneliness is a killer. We know that there is a massive epidemic of loneliness now in industrial life. Being lonely increases your mortality risk by about 45%. In other words, being lonely is twice as risky for your death than obesity. Striking.
Yeah, there was actually a study showing loneliness changes like a massive amount of gene expression and like upregulates NF-kappa B, cortisol, like all these pro-inflammatory genes. So it makes sense that they'd be associated with.
And what's bizarre about loneliness, by the way, I'm taking a complete, this has got nothing to do with sleep, but if you look at the profile of your gene expression and your immune system, you've got some immune components that will go after viruses. And viruses can only be transmitted from one human being to another by way of touch. They can't live outside of our bodies. Bacteria, so if you scrape yourself on a fence, like, walking past it, you can get a bacterial infection because bacteria can live outside of the body. When you become lonely, your gene expression shifts you away from a profile of immunity that normally deals with viruses, pushes you to more towards a bacterial defense profile.
Really?
Isn't that incredible?
You just sent me that study. That's fascinating.
No. There's a couple of folks at UCLA who, if you ever have interest in this area of how loneliness, the mind, mood.
Totally.
Okay, I've got to give you these people. I'm a complete fan of their work, and they did this study. It just blew my mind. How could a concept that is so out there, believe in loneliness, toughen up. What's wrong with you? Go out and make some. How could that change the expression of your genes and even alter how you, the organism, fend for yourself from an immunological
Ils sont rentrés là-bas.
shifting you from viral to bacterial. But anyway, so back, I was desperately concerned about the state of loneliness.
N'y allez pas, si. J'ai des frappes et tout, c'est pas mieux, on achète des frappes et tout.
On va envoyer une frappe, il y a évasion, on s'en fout. Including anxiety. And when I was reading the studies where they would take animals and they would deprive them of sleep, you've got this anxiogenic profile where you've got cortisol increasing, you've got a shift in insulin, glucose regulation, all of the bad things that you would not wish to happen, and anxiety, fear like behavior, all by way of sleep. There's also is that sometimes the research would note, despite not measuring it systematically, that the animals would often be secluded by themselves in the cage, even when they were with other conspecifics. And other conspecifics would not approach them either.
Okay.
And so it seemed to me, just from reading this, I thought, well, this seems like an animal phenotype of human loneliness. And it seems to be caused by a lack of sleep. So we decided to catch the and the first part of the study was the proof. They went to the switch twice. They were do you have a social repulsion boundary, and that boundary is increased when you are sleep deprived? So I think everyone has that sense that if I start moving closer to you, you think, okay, do you know what? At some point, that's kind of enough. That's about my sleep close to. What's interesting is that if I ask a sleep deprived practitioner to sleep, and I ask you towards the sleep deprived individual, and the individual says stop when they feel comfortable, relative to when that very same individual, when you're sleep deprived, you decide to push people a further distance away from you. So you have a lowered desire for social proximity and social interaction. Second, we then replicated that findings, but now we put them inside the MRI scanner. Because in order to see what was changing in the brain to produce this social repulsion, what we found was that the regions of the brain that are the alarm network, stay away from the network that is sort of in the parietal cortex and the premotor cortex. It's sort of what we call the near space network. So it creates your comfort of boundary, and when objects start to approach you, it alarms to say, incoming, be cautious, be worried. That part of the brain became hyperactive when people as if you were getting this repulsion signal from the brain. If that wasn't bad enough, the other parts of the brain that have been called the theory of mind network, which sort of helps you understand the intent of the people. It's a pro-social network in the brain. It cooperates pro-social interaction. That part of the
c'est pas incroyable, je me suis fait de l'autre côté de la planète, voilà.
So we weren't satisfied with that. Next, we wanted to say, could someone who just looked at these sleep deprived individuals, could they actually focus on being lonelier and looking lonelier and
Oh non, c'est lui qui me tue en plus sur le toit là.
We also did video interviews. We asked them general questions. Tell us about a movie that you watched or what's happening in the news this week, just bland stuff. And then we got 1,000. It was over 1,000 people. 1,080 people.
Vous êtes en pleine zone, vous avez juste à guetter, ils vont sauter tous là.
Nothing about the experiment. They didn't know it was about sleep.
À droite, à droite, à droite.
And we showed them just a 60-second clip when they were a good night of sleep when they were sleep deprived. And we just asked them, how lonely does the person feel?
Ça push.
And they knew nothing. But despite knowing that, they consistently and reliably rated the sleep deprived person. We also asked them, would you socially interact with this person? Would you friend them on Facebook? Would you work with them in a business environment? And they consistently rated that they would prefer not to engage and interact with them.
Is that because they just look unhappy? Or
well, we actually think it's that their appearance, but also their vocal tone. We think there's a lot of this is now one of the key things. What's communicated is a social profile.
Oh, so they were listening to them speak.
So they watched them and they listened to them speak, so they could hear them as well. So we demonstrated that there was, unfortunately, this social repulsion on both sides of the equation. When you're sleep deprived, you yourself don't want to have anything to do with other people. And that
remontez par la
would only
droite.
at least come to your rescue because they would see you in need. The opposite is true. People find you socially repulsive as a consequence. So there's a push from both sides of the social dyad.
The
next thing, those people who were rating the sleep-deprived individuals, we also said, look, how lonely do you feel after just this 60-second clip? And they themselves felt lonelier after interacting with sleep-deprived individuals. In other words, there's contagion of sleep deprivation-induced loneliness.
So I wonder how much of this can be translated to like someone that, say for example, gets only 5 or 6 hours of sleep. Of course, not getting a full night's sleep. You know, maybe there's like just a little bit of this penetrating.
Well, we then asked that final part of the study, which is that we said, okay, This is extreme sleep deprivation, and most of the population does not undergo this. What about a more
Bon allez l'équipe, merci pour cette victoire.
Are small perturbations of sleep from one night to the next, do they predict how lonely you experience yourself from one day to the next? And these are small, minute changes in sleep. Tens of minutes. Lo and behold, even just that small change in your sleep from one night to the next, we could measure, predicted how lonely you would experience life the next day from one day to the next. So it doesn't even take, small minutes.
I remember reading somewhere too that isn't the amygdala like overactive or something happens. There's not like an inhibitory signal that occurs if you're sleep deprived. Or,
That's right.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
So then you're feeling more, you're like alarmed and just anxious and feeling that threat.
That's right.
That ongoing threat that really isn't there.
Exactly, yeah. So we published a study in 2007 where we, again, sort of sleep-deprived people, put them inside an MRI scanner, and we showed them increasingly negative and aversive and unpleasant images. And what we saw is that relative to people who'd got a full night of sleep, the amygdala, this sort of emotional epicenter for the generation of strong emotional impulsive reactions, that deep emotional center was 60% more reactive under conditions of a lack of sleep. And then we asked why. Why is your emotional brain so sort of sensitive and erupting with such extraordinary activity? And what we then went on to find out in later work was that
I need to sleep.